All right, everyone. It's a couple of minutes past 9 o'clock. It's the usual academic grace period for lectures, especially in the morning. Let's get started. I introduced myself to you already, but just in case some of you weren't here or some of you forgot, I'm still Sanjeev Khudanpur. I still teach here in electrical computer engineering, computer science, and it is my fun joy today to give you a couple of lectures on automatic speech recognition. So I'm going to start with the first hour dedicated to what my colleague Philip Cohn often calls classical speech recognition. Right? And then in the second half, I'll get into more modern techniques and so on. Now, you might look at the slide and say, wait a minute, I get the joke on the top. Yes, that's fine. And I get the title, Basic Mathematics, but really you're using slides from 2000. I wasn't even born then, right? How many of you are born after 2000? Okay, so yes. Why do I do this? Not because I'm lazy. You'll see my second slides and see how much work went into making them. I want to make a point. The point is the basic ideas have not changed in all these years. There's a lot of fancy glue around everything. There are some new techniques which are really brilliant, and we'll talk about them. But don't think speech recognition was invented in the last 10 years. It's been around for a long time, the basic ideas. So the reason I have these particular slides is because in 2000, I was invited to go to the Institute for Mathematics and its applications in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota for a semester. And my job there was to basically educate a bunch of math postdocs about how speech recognition, and then along with other colleagues who talk about computer vision, how all these things work, natural language processing, so that they could apply their mathematical brains to solving problems, right? And so these slides are from there, and I prepared it with a particular view audience in mind. And I've found over and over again after that I still find them useful. So I'm going to use those for the first hour. All right, okay. So very quickly, what are these human language technologies? What is speech recognition? Well, speech recognition is one of the many language technologies. It's that first bullet. People often think of it as something that you will use as spoken input to a computer system. So you'll talk to a computer. It has other uses which don't necessarily involve a person trying to give speech input to a computer. For example, you might be analyzing everything on YouTube to find things that you like. So people on YouTube didn't really give their speech to the computer with the intention that the computer transcribe it, but you use it after the fact and so on and so forth. Other technologies like handwriting recognition is also useful. It's a little bit like speech recognition, except it's a image or a video sequence rather than a time series of pressure values. And then information retrieval, web search, you all know that. Text understanding. By the way, a lot of the modern last 5 years of NLP and HLT has been about text understanding and about whether computers can make sense of text. Machine translation was very big for a while, still pretty big. How to translate from one language to another. Summarization, like you read a lot of papers. Can you give me a summary of everything you have, so on and so forth. But there are other interesting forms of summarization. How many of you go to Google and click or look for a restaurant and this little info box pops up with the opening and closing times, how busy it is, menu, right? That's a summary of the restaurant's webpage generated fully automatically. Google has sort of a template-like thing to fill it out, but the actual summary is created automatically. You'll often see when you search for something in Google, you'll see something on the top which is just actual text about what you're looking for, not any web page. And that's a summary from some web page about what you're looking for. The summarization is a very useful thing. And summarization often involves language generation, because what you see in that little info box may not be verbatim from what's from the web page. Google actually synthesizes text. So actually not just Google, others. So there are a lot of interesting applications. Some people think of machine translation as an analysis followed by generation problem. You should just read the original language text, figure out what it means, and generate a sentence in the other language or the target language. And so there is a notion of treating machine translation as a text generation problem. Speech synthesis, of course, nowadays you all hear people's voices being cloned and other fun stuff. Synthesis has become good enough that nowadays speech doesn't sound like a robot, right? And of course, dialogue management. We all interact with computers, and computers need to know what we've talked about in the past. I mean, like, one of the more fun things about these big models like GPT and all that is that you can have an interaction today, and or maybe 5 minutes later, you go back, ask it the same thing, and it doesn't know you were there already. It doesn't have a notion of state and what's going on. So all these things fall into language technologies. Today, we're going to focus on one of them, speech recognition. So what do you use speech recognition for? Well, when it started back in the, I'd even say, mid-80s or maybe 90s, I'm not sure. There was this whole research in what will we do with speech recognition. According to my colleague, Fred Jelinek, who passed away some years ago and after whom this workshop is named, back when he went to IBM in the early 80s, I think, to work on speech recognition, IBM had this idea that, oh, they've built these powerful computers. It was called the IBM 360, I think. Probably has a little bit more power than your smartwatch, but it was at that time considered pretty powerful. Right? They said, what do we do with it? Okay, maybe the IRS will buy a couple of these big machines, and maybe the National Security Agency does cryptography. They will buy a couple. But who else will buy? Oh, wait, we have to invent applications that require a lot of computing. Let's work on speech recognition. So this is the story as I know it from Fred. I'm not sure it's fully true, but they were looking for applications that would sell more computers. But the real useful things first started happening with phone companies. So AT&T, for example, actually, let me just start this. How many of you have actually ever used a phone where you had to touch a button and make these tone sounds for something? Probably a few. These things are going out of fashion because nowadays there are better ways to do things. But it's pretty standard to have a telephone where you say, call up someplace and say, hey, I'm looking for some information. And you don't get a person. You first get this thing that says, for credit card and calling card information, press 1. For correct calls, press 2. About billing information, press 3. And you press a button, right? So AT&T used to have this big problem. And they used to say, how can we make things easier for people? So one of the first things they tried is press or say 1, press or say 3. Simple speech recognition, 10 digits, 0 through 9, and maybe people will say, oh, but there's not a whole lot more people do with it. So that was one of the applications. Another one, which again, AT&T came with a little later, it was called AT&T How May I Help You? So what is this How May I Help You? Again, funny thing, AT&T at that time, by the way, was kind of a monopoly, although they had already been broken up by the FCC, and they were the baby bells, as they called them, right? And they used to have a call center. And like a big company, you don't want to give 20,000 numbers to your customers. They just gave one number, 1-800-CALL-ATT. And you call that number no matter what issue you had with AT&T. If you're a big business and you were looking to have opened a new office and wanted a private exchange and other things, you called AT&T. If you're a poor grad student who was looking at a $50 bill and saying, oh my God, this is too much, and what did I do? You want to dispute something, you call the same number. You're a shopkeeper, you call the same number. Everything. You want to make an international call the same number. You want to change your calling plan, call the same number. And what they had is about 200 people who received that call. And the first thing they asked is, AT&T, how may I help you? I said, well, I need to call my grandmother. She's in Oklahoma. I can't. Okay, what do you look at? Directory assistance. They'd just transfer you to another person who did directory assistance. That's all these 200 people did, 24/7, right? And so AT&T had some of my colleagues, Al Gorin and others, they fielded the system where when you called, the computer came up and said, AT&T, how may I help you? And the person simply said whatever they wanted to say, and this thing just did 20-way call routing. Nothing special, right? Today it sounds easy, but at that time it was quite a feat. And you can imagine if I saved you 200 jobs a year, or 3 shifts maybe, so 600, how much money do you think that is? So imagine hiring 600 people and not needing them anymore. Anyway, so that was the kind of thing that they were doing in the time. Again, to make the dialogue more interesting, this was one-off, right? You called, you said something, you got routed, it was done. Dialogue. DARPA, how many of you have heard of DARPA? DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They've been responsible for a lot of AI technology in the world. They've been funding basic science in universities and companies for decades, right? So DARPA said, hey, let's make these dialogue things real. So they funded the creation of something called the Air Travel Information System, or ATIS. So this was a set of, it was a set of tools which connected with Sabre. Sabre is the back-end airline fare information database and all that, right? Heavy duty stuff. And on the front end, you would build an application where you could call a phone number and book yourself a plane ticket. right? That's what it was. I want to go from Boston to Texas, Arlington tomorrow afternoon. Did you say going from Austin to Arlington? No, Boston. Okay. When do you need to go? Sometime in the afternoon. And in the back, it's like, okay, today is the 11th of June, so that's 12th of June, so that kind of stuff. So there was dialogue, very computer-directed dialogue. Where do you want to go from? Where do you want to go to? What time do you want to travel? Right? Pretty controlled, and the whole idea was how to do this well. And this technology drove, this need rather application drove the technology for a couple of years, a few years actually. And one of the first commercial deployments of speech recognition on the phone was actually by some airline companies. And instead of giving to the public where all sorts of chaos could happen, they gave it to their employees. A lot of employees for airlines travel for free, except that they have to go on wait lists, they have to inquire about flights. And they said, okay, use the system, eat your own dog food. So if it screws up, it screws up. You're an employee. What are you going to do? Right? So I'm joking, but yeah. So, and then later on, the second place where the airlines employed it was lost baggage inquiries. Turns out that when you lose your bags, you're so mad that you give the agent on the other end a hard time. The poor beast is just sitting there taking your abuse, nothing they can do except look up on the computer what they can tell you. People used to quit these jobs saying, I can't deal with all the idiots in the world. So I said, okay, talk to a computer, never gets upset. So those are the kind of things people did. Back in the late 80s, maybe even early 90s, companies thought that the killer app for speech recognition would be people not having to type anything. You'd write your reports by talking to your computer. You'd write memos in the office. You'd write letters to your friends, all using computers and just talking to them. So there were these products. VIA Voice is an IBM product, or was, and Naturally Speaking was a product by a company called Dragon Systems, which then got bought by somebody, bought by somebody, bought by somebody, bought by Nuance, which was bought by Microsoft. So that's the whole chain of acquisitions there. But anyway, so these things were desktop dictation systems. You would install it on your computer. In those days, it came on a CD-ROM. And then you set it up. You talk to it for 15 minutes to let it get used to your voice. And then you try to dictate memos. Guess what? People aren't used to sitting in an office and talking to the computers by themselves, especially if it's work-related stuff. It sounds funny. So never took off, never made any money, but very big step up from air travel information. Guess why? Air travel information is a very constrained task, right? If I look at all the vocabulary anybody uses when booking a ticket on, let's say, Delta Airlines, right? Other than the city names, how many distinct words do you think they use? What's the vocabulary of plane reservations? 1,000 words max, mostly few hundred, right? So basically, it's not a very challenging task. Dictation, on the other hand, well, you're a lawyer, you're going to write some kind of stuff. You're a doctor, you're going to write other stuff. You're a university professor teaching physics, one kind of stuff. You're an anthropologist, another vocabulary, right? So this really opened up the challenge to the technology. You'd have very large vocabularies and so on and so forth, right? Of course, there was this, YouTube isn't new. The idea that we may have to transcribe and caption all sorts of videos existed for a long time. Some of it is driven by the needs of people with disabilities. If you can't hear, you'd rather have your TV programs captioned live and so on. And sometimes live captioning is not possible because there's nobody to caption. Other times when they do it, it's still a little crummy because the captioner cannot keep up with the speech and so on and so forth. So, and it's expensive. But also post hoc search. Even before the era of YouTube and video on the web, there were always large video archives, and there was a need to index them and search them. A classic example of this is back in 2000, we worked on a project with an organization called the Shoah Foundation. It was set up by Spielberg, and basically he recorded, or he had people record the interviews of Holocaust survivors from the Second World War. And there's about 110,000 hours of video. And these are really rich, interesting testimonies. Some people are shaking their heads because the Charles University in Prague, where some of our colleagues are from, actually has a mirror archive, right? And this is of great historical value. It's of great educational value. If you want to understand how systemic oppression and pogroms work in the world, you can just listen to these testimonials and tell you all the little things that were done. Oh, they used to paint a sign on our door so everybody knew we were Jewish. Okay, all right. See, that's how it works. Oh, it's all about making sure we can provide services, but the real agenda is to mark people for persecution. So whatever the reasons were, you can hear that. Also, you can hear about people's, you can hear good things, how people survived, how they kept faith, how people did well, how people helped each other, right? So all those stories are in there. So those transcribing 110,000 hours is no mean feat, but if you could transcribe it automatically, you could search for it, look for things and so on. It has security applications already, counterterrorism. One of the things that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union is that a lot of the national threats to the US and other countries became non-state actors. When even today we still have a beef with the Russians. You know where the Russians are. They're in the embassy. They're here. They're there. You know where to look for them, where to listen to them. But these non-state actors are everywhere. You never know where they're going to come from. So just to keep track of bad actors, you just have to listen to lots and lots of phone calls. And so that's a real need, a real application. And countries do it. Snowden, of course, exposed that some things are done less legally than others, and people hopefully will fix that. But the point is that this is a real need, right? And then all this, of course, is inspired by science fiction. Who all likes C-3PO? Maybe you guys think BB-8 is better. I don't know, but C-3PO at least talks for real. It doesn't beep and squeak like R2. Now, R2 is cute, but speech, come on. Yeah. Right, yeah. And of course, I don't think how many of you follow Star Trek? Commander Data? No. Okay, he's an android, has full language capabilities. So these are things that inspire you to think about what you could do if speech recognition got perfect one day. By the way, C-3PO is also a universal translator. He can translate speech from any language to any other language across the galaxy. I don't know how many million languages. Anyone remembers? No. Okay. No diehard fans. Okay, never mind. All right. So these are things. So how easy or hard is the speech recognition? Well, it depends on a lot of things. This is a politician-like answer. So isolated words. In the early days, people would require that you talk to your computer with small pauses between words so that it knew where the word boundaries were. Right? And then it became an isolated word recognition problem, and then you could hopefully do something about it. If you keep talking continuously without breaks and very fluently, and I say euthanasia, you don't know whether I'm talking about young people in India, China, Japan, or whether I'm talking about mercy killing. Right? So so continuous speech is harder for a number of reasons. Speaking style. News anchors make great examples of demos for speech recognition. If you want to show your stuff works, run it on Anderson Cooper or whatever. They're very eloquent and they articulate well, easy to recognize. Spontaneous speech, a little bit harder. You should listen to, we have databases of fluent conversations between people. And if two people know each other well, it's really hard to understand what they're talking about, even if you know the language, because there's so much shared context and other things going on between them. Enrollment. Known speakers are always easier. It's probably true about you as well. You might have friends with very thick accents or who are otherwise not easy to understand for other reasons, but once you're around them for a few months, easy peasy, right? Same thing for computers. New speakers are harder, unknown speakers are harder, right? Vocabularies. Back when I gave this lecture, 100 was considered small, 20,000 was considered large. Today, even a few thousand would be considered a small, maybe 1,000 is considered a small vocabulary today. Computers are just bigger. We can handle more things. And 100,000 or more would be considered large. Noise levels. Do people know what decibels are? Do you know what bells are? It's the ratio of loudness of the signal to the noise, and you take its log, and that's a bell, and you multiply by 10, and it's a decibel, and but divide by 10 rather. Okay, so that's basically noise levels. Low means it's clean, high means it's large because it's signal to noise ratio, right? So if the noise levels in this room, the noise level is probably, is it what, 30 dB, better, 40? Matthew, what's the noise level at this time in this room? Or 20? Okay, so there's already, yeah, actually that's true. We can hear some air conditioning. Yeah, yeah. So 20, 30 dBs is easy. 10 dB is when, roughly speaking, the noise is about the same loudness as the speech you're listening to. And that point onwards, it's downhill. Things get harder and harder. Channels. If you get voice over a good quality microphone, especially if it's a close talking microphone like this guy, it'll be pretty good. If it's a distant microphone like Alexa sitting in your kitchen, or other things. Cell phones are actually pretty bad, not because the microphone's far, because there's a lot of compression and coding that happens when you transmit. If it's voice over IP, there is packet loss. You've all heard bad quality audio in your life, you know that. So that just makes things harder. So that's the channel, right? So all these things make left side things are easy, right side things are hard. And if you get everything on the right, you're hosed. If you get everything on the left, it'll probably work pretty well, right? Okay, so this is the task. So what is the task then? So the task of speech recognition is to take some acoustic signal, which is received at some microphone in the form of some pressure sensing, which becomes an electrical signal. That's the waveform you see up there, and write down the words. Straightforward to describe. So this is where I have a little bit of audio. Let me just play this audio for you. So here is the sentence.
Folks at home and our own folks at home and our own folks at home and
okay, sounds simple enough, right? So people looked at this problem, and when they first started thinking about how to tackle it, back in the, actually already started in the 60s. So there's somebody called Raj Reddy who used to be at CMU. He retired as their first professor, then department head, then the dean of computer science. His PhD thesis in the 60s was on speech recognition. So back when people started speech recognition, we said, okay, how do we do this? How do people do this? How do you listen to this and write down? So, let's understand how people understand speech and language and so on. And of course, we turn to linguistics. So prior knowledge. We know that we compose our thoughts into words, phrases, clauses, put them together in sentences. So here's an example. The sentence says, I bought a gift for my brother at the mall, and it has been parsed. So some of you have done NLP, others haven't. If you haven't, don't worry about it. What you see over there are lines on the top that connect words, pairs of words, right? So I is connected to bought. Bought is connected to gift. It's also connected to at. And gift is connected to a, gift is also connected to for is connected to brother is connected to my, and so on and so forth, right? And so what the sentence says is, and the top of the sentence is bought. So this sentence is about buying, and I am doing the buying, and the gift is the one that's being bought, and it's a gift. It's not the gift or some gift. It's a gift, meaning some generic gift. And it's, well, who's the gift for? It's for my brother, right? And so on and so forth. So this is the way we think about things. So we said, okay, we should understand grammar and try to put grammar into a speech recognizer so that they understand what people are trying to do, right? So they're just trying to inject prior knowledge into the speech recognizer. This particular thing, by the way, is called the link grammar. It was cute for a while. It's a class of what's called dependency grammars. And I think you might see one of the other lectures later in this week talk about these things. Of course, these words are pronounced in certain canonical ways. So own is pronounced as O followed by N. Folks is pronounced as followed by O followed by S. Right? So there are 4 sounds in it. And the O in own is nominally the same O as in folks. So these are phonemes. And of course, these phonemes have to be realized acoustically. And when you realize phonemes acoustically, things happen to them. So for example, the O in own is next to a nasal. So I want you guys to go ahead and make the O sound, O. And now make the N sound, N. Now go from an O to the N, O, N. So what happens is your tongue closes up your oral cavity and lets air out through your nasal cavity, right? And while that transition is happening, this O actually has this funny thing where it's kind of being closed and open. So the N has an effect on the O. So if you look at this signal itself, the O in own is quite different from the O in folks, right? So what's happening with the O in folks? What happens immediately after the O? O, you're making a complete stop, right? So that's a whole other phenomenon. So phonemes, when they're realized, they're affected by what's around them. And so these things are, linguists call them allophones. They are different realizations of a phoneme. So why don't I call them 2 different symbols? Why are they both called O? Well, there's a little bit of theory and thinking behind it. So phonemes are defined as minimal units. In other words, I need to be able to find 2 words which are identical in everything except one sound, and that sound changes the meaning of the word, and then I'll call them 2 different sounds. So based on this different minimal useful or minimal meaningful difference idea, you can figure out how many sounds do you need to represent a language. And it turns out whether the O is nasal, has a nasal after it or not, doesn't change any word. All words that have O followed by N mean the same thing. And O followed by, like, K, it doesn't have an impact on meaning. That's why they're considered the same sound, right? So these are the kind of things that people used to do. And then, of course, how do we recognize these sounds? So there's a lot of psychoacoustics in there. So here is how people who study phonetics think about sound. So up there is the same waveform, our own folks at home, right? What's done after that, I'll sort of try and point you to it. Hopefully you guys can see the mouse on the screen. So you see these little vertical lines and letters below them. So this is A, the double A, R, O, F, O, K, E, and so on, right? And there's almost no T over here, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the phonemes. So they've actually carefully marked this in time, saying from here to here is this sound, here to here is this sound. So this is a phonetic transcription or analysis or time alignment of the acoustics, right? And what's below is the same speech represented a different way. So what this is a spectrogram. Is there someone who has not seen a spectrogram before? Anyone? Everybody has seen one. Okay, good. So I'll be quick. So what it is on the y-axis is frequency, x-axis is time again. And each vertical line is a little slice of speech. You do a little spectrum, and you represent the spectrum as a function of frequency and magnitude. And this is the magnitude spectrum, and the darkness tells you how high the spectrum value is, or how much energy there is at a particular frequency. The frequency in this picture goes from 0 to 4,000 hertz. Time goes from 0 to 1.8 seconds. And so what you see over here is when somebody's saying, oh, you see a lot of energy in two spectral bands. There's another O over here, and you see energy in two others. It's the same two spectral bands, more or less. There's a third O here. This is own, folks, and home. And that O also has energy. There's a folks, there's a S over here. And what you see for an S is high frequency energy. Because when you're making a S sound, it's just noise, right? The same thing happens with, actually home is a little bit like that, except that it's kind of dead. Home is, her sound is like a no sound. Okay, so these are the kind of sounds. So when phoneticians study speech and they say, how do people understand or hear phonemes? They say, oh, people pay attention to energies at certain spectral frequencies. They pay attention to certain change rates at which energy is in a particular frequency is changing as a function of time and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of things. The more is known about this. So what's known, for example, is that our sensitivity to frequency change is not linear. It's much easier to tell 10 and 20 hertz apart than it is to tell 100 and 110 hertz apart, even though they're still 10 hertz apart. And then even harder to tell 1,000 and 1,010 apart, right? Roughly speaking, our ability to discriminate between nearby frequencies grows with frequency. So in other words, we can't distinguish nearby things, so you need to be further away, which means that how much energy you have at the higher frequency bands, whether it's on one or the other, doesn't matter so much, but it matters more where it is on the lower bands. In the same way, our response to loudness is not linear. If the signal magnitude or power goes up, we don't linearly perceive it to be doubly loud or half as loud. It's roughly logarithmic, or some will say cube root, doesn't matter. It's basically nonlinear, right? So taking all these things into account and the linguistics, people said, okay, let's now start building some features. So what features do we want to extract? Well, this is the kind of stuff that was done for a long time and is still done. So by using psychoacoustic studies and so on and so forth, they said, okay, this is the main part in the middle here, right? They even studied the human ear. There's an organ called the cochlea, which is like about this long, and it's coiled up inside your ear, and it's a tube. Inside that are hair cells along another tube. On the other end is the eardrum, and when it vibrates, it sets up pressure waves in the fluid in the ear, and then different hair cells vibrate or are tuned to different frequencies. Sometimes biologists refer to it as the tonotopic axis of the cochlea, right? And so you hear high frequencies by the vibration of this cell, the low frequency by the vibration of that cell, and so on and so forth, right? So that response is also logarithmic in frequency and amplitude. So based on that, they said, let's take the Fourier transform of a little bit of signal, and then bin the magnitude into a small number of bins, where the bins are narrow at the low frequencies, become wider at the high frequencies. So you take a spectrum which might have 256 or 512 values and convert it into 18 numbers, right? By just aggregating the energies, and there's so many frequencies at the beginning, a little bit more, and so on. By the way, these are overlapping bands. Then you take the log of that, because we know that, the ear is not sensitive to absolute energy, it's sensitive to the log of the energy. Okay, so take that. And then, of course, you do some simple decorrelation. You apply an inverse cosine or inverse Fourier transform. To me, this is just a statistical trick. It has other signal processing advantages and so on. So this gives you something called a cepstrum. So it's a vector, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 dimensions, which is derived out of one slice of the spectrum in the spectrogram, right? You do this every 10 milliseconds. So you take this speech signal, which is one-dimensional pressure wave. Think of it as two-dimensional first with frequency and time, then chop it up into little slices, get 18 numbers out of each, stack up the 18 vectors, and in today's technology, you have an 18 by T tensor. That's your speech, right? Everybody happy? So we know from psychoacoustic studies that this is sort of useful enough that one should be able to transcribe speech using this as its input representation, right? So people use this, try to recognize individual phonemes. There's a corpus called TIMIT that was created. It has carefully phonetically transcribed phonemes and so on and so forth. And then people try to get the phonemes together into words and bring in grammar. So all that work was going well, not making a lot of progress, but making slow progress. And then along came a group from IBM in the early 80s and said, all this is boring. We're going to do speech recognition a different way, right? They said, we're going to treat this as a communications problem. What do you mean by that? Well, so when people think of words to speak, we'll think of it as a source that generates data, like bytes or bits, right? And we'll call the word sequence W. So boldface W is a sequence of words, right? Then the person uses their mouth and tongue and lungs and larynx and everything to produce a pressure wave. It goes through the air, it hits the listener's eardrum, and the cochlea does its thing, and some neuronal stuff comes out of the back of the ear and goes into the auditory cortex. We'll call that A. In fact, we'll use this Mel-Cepstrum vector thingies because it's already done what the ear needs to do, and we'll use that as A. And then we'll treat everything in the middle over here, the speech production, the speech perception, and all the transmission of the speech over the air. We'll treat that whole thing as a channel. And we'll say, this is like a communication system. Some bits W went in on the input, the channel did something to it, and some things A came out of the output. Now we just have to recognize what bits went into the channel. And people in communication systems have been doing this for decades, right? And in fact, some of the people who started this at IBM were information theorists, including Fred Jelinek and Lilith Bal. So they said, let's formulate it this way. My linguistic decoder needs to try and estimate what the input W was. So its output W hat is going to be the W that maximizes the posterior probability of W given A over all A's. So this notation hopefully is simple to everyone. P is a probabilistic model. W given A is a conditional probability of the word sequence W. So this boldface W is a sequence given the vector sequence A. So remember, A is that sequence of 18-dimensional cepstral vectors, one every 10 milliseconds for however many seconds you have, right? So A is that whole block of input. W is a sequence of words. And I could hypothesize every possible word sequence over there, starting from ABBA, 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 ABBA to Zurich, 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 Zurich. All word sequences are allowed. And I just want to test all of them and find the W that maximizes this posterior probability, right? And then I said, okay, just like people do in communication systems, we'll break down this P of W given A as a ratio of a few things. So first, let's write P of W given A as P of W a joint probability divided by P of A. That's just the definition of conditional probability. And then take the joint probability P of AW and write it as P of W times P of A given W. Just decompose it the other way, right? So if you do that, then you say, okay, I have to maximize this ratio over all values of W. A is fixed, A is the input, right? So I don't really need to care about the denominator. I just need to maximize the numerator. Everyone with me? Yep. And therefore, I'm going to do this. I'm going to build two probabilistic models. I'm going to build a model for what word sequences are, meaning what word sequences are more likely than the other. So is youth in Asia more likely or euthanasia? So that's P of W. That's called a language model. And then how does the acoustic vector sequence look when I say apple or banana? Like, what do the sequence of vectors look given a word or a sequence of words? That's the acoustic model, right? So this is a model on sequences of words or discrete symbols. This is a model on sequences of vectors given a sequence of symbols. Everybody with me? So the thing on the left is called the acoustic model. The thing on the right is the language model. And then, of course, I have to find the W that maximizes the product of these two probabilities given a fixed A and given that W is my free variable, right? And now this is an optimization problem. So we've got ourselves three problems. Figure out a probability for word sequences. That's the first problem, P of L. Figure out a probability distribution over acoustic vector sequences given word sequences. That's the acoustic model. That's problem number 2. And then once you have both those probability models, put them together, take an A that's given to you, put it into that, go over this gigantic possible set of W's. Why is it gigantic? Just think of it. If I had a 100-word vocabulary and a 5-word sequence, how many words am I looking at? How many sequences? 5 to the 100. Not a small number, right? So basically, that's a huge optimization problem, and we need to solve that. So these are sort of the core component problems of speech recognition as they were recognized already back in the 80s. And by the way, they're still there today, right? We still work with them, even though some of these neural models seem to hide the details from you. By the end of today, you'll see that they're still there. So language modeling, as I just said, assigns probability to sequences of words. How do you construct it? Well, get lots and lots of text, right? Back when I joined Hopkins, we had a 40 million word corpus of text. It was considered huge. We used to do experiments with a 2 million subset because 40 million was too many, right? But today, of course, we are in the trillions. But that's basically P of W. All these big language models are basically P of Ws, right? So this idea was already there in the 80s. Of course, language use is very different in different situations. The way a news anchor reads news versus the way you talk to your friends versus the way I give a lecture are all very different things. The language use is very different. The style is very different. So it helps to do task-specific modeling. So if I could get lots of lectures transcribed, I'd probably build a better P of W for transcribing lectures than if I just took all the newswire text that's available on the web, right? So there is such a thing as getting task-specific text, but that's a basic problem. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. Everybody happy with problem number 1? I haven't told you what the model is, but we'll get to that, right? Second problem is acoustic modeling. To do this, you'd need lots of paired samples of speech and transcripts, right? This is the big ask, even today, to get lots and lots of speech which is transcribed. Of course, there are things out there nowadays, thanks to the internet, which you can get your hands on. But even then, this always remains the big challenge, right? Especially if you think about languages where there isn't a lot of internet audio. Even Whisper's OpenAI, which has, I don't know, the first version had 680,000 hours of transcribed speech in it, which is about 77 plus years of continuous listening, more than the median lifetime of US males. Even then, they had something like half an hour in Georgian, half an hour in, I don't know, a bunch of languages. So that's all they could get their hands on. The second version is more like 1 million hours, but still, many languages are not poorly represented. So P of A given W is still a challenge if you're looking at languages or situations. By the way, P of A given W, unfortunately, also needs to take care of a lot of other things. Voice over a telephone sounds different from voice coming from a radio broadcast studio. Alexa in your kitchen has very different acoustics than, let's say, the Zoom lecture with the microphone here. So there are a lot of differences in the acoustics. And remember, A is just the acoustic vector, includes everything, not just the words. So unfortunately, P of A given W has a big burden and has to model a lot of things. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And last but not the least, I already said this hypothesis search is a non-trivial problem because the search space is very, very large. Right? So finding the optimum in a discrete optimization setting where your search space is basically combinatorially large can be quite a challenge. Some of your computer scientists, Things don't get much NP harder than this. Okay. So let's go through each of them a little bit. So the acoustic model. Obviously, finding a probability distribution or estimating a probability distribution for A given W, training a model to do it for every different W doesn't make sense, because for all you know, the W that you train on may never be said again. W, remember, is a whole word sequence, right? So what you really need is probabilities for individual words, so you can string them together somehow. Even individual words, you may not hear all the words that you might have to recognize often enough. In fact, if you go collect 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours of speech, you might get a few, maybe, Matthew, how much in Libri speech our vocabulary is, what, 100,000 or less? Yeah, so English has much more than 100,000 words, but even 1,000 hours of English, you only get 100 words, which means many, many, many words in English are not seen in the 1,000 hours that you collected and transcribed. So how much further are you going to go? So you can't cover all words either. So even models for individual words is hard, let alone how will we put them together once we have models for each word, right? Remember, because I said words don't appear in isolation. When you speak fluently, there's co-articulation that goes on between words. So having enough examples of going and enough examples of to never will give you a model for going to or gonna, right? So there are all sorts of stuff that happens. So you really need lots of data. So words are not enough. Okay, how about phonemes? Now we're getting somewhere, because the number of phonemes in the language is finite, usually of the order of 100, even less, 50, right? So if you could build a model for each phoneme, and then we had some magical way of stringing them together, so we would have a P of A given phoneme, the acoustic vectors that correspond to a phoneme, and then we would put them together somehow to construct our P of A given W. So this is the learning problem. So let's try and do it that way. That was the initial idea. And the models that were proposed are called hidden Markov models. So here's a quick picture. So if the word sequence was and, our only, then I could write it down in its phonemes as a sequence a, d, a, o, e, right? So that's a phoneme sequence. And I'd replace each phoneme with a model that's a model for the acoustic vector that gets observed when somebody tries to say a or or r. And so the little things over there, I'll tell you in a minute what they are. What they're showing you is the temporal evolution of the words. So you might say for several frames. So you run around that little blue machine, and each arrow or loop in that machine corresponds to generating one frame of that acoustic vector. Remember the spectrogram, it has 18-dimensional vectors, 500 of them. So if I said and our only, so the A produces the first frame, maybe even the second frame, maybe the third frame, and so on and so forth. And then at some point you transition to the pink part and you start producing the hour and so on and so forth, right? So this is a basic hidden Markov model. So what it is it's comprised of these. So let's focus on the variables first. So you define a set of variables called S. S are called states. So think of S as phonemes, or think of them as pieces of a phoneme. The beginning of an A, the middle of an A, the end of an A, the beginning of a D, middle of the D, end of the D, beginning of a T, middle of a T, end of a T. So each of them is a state. So this little S can take a value. Let's say you had 50 phonemes and each phoneme had 3 pieces. So 150 values that S can take, right? And P of ST given ST minus 1 simply says if you're in the middle of saying a T, the first part of a T at this time, what is the probability that you'd still be saying the first part of the T? What's the probability you'd be saying the second part of the T? What's the probability you'd be saying something else? Right? So that's a transition probability. That's P of ST given ST minus 1. And then when you're saying the first part of a T, what kind of acoustics you produce? That's called the emission probability. So the way you want to think about this picture is these circles here represent the states, and the arrows represent how you can travel between these states. So you can produce the first bit of a T, a couple of frames, that's 10 plus 10, 20 milliseconds. Then go over here, maybe produce the second bit of the T, then go over here, produce the third bit and continue, or produce the first bit of an A, and then hang around here, produce several frames with the middle of A, and then one more and so on, right? So this is a stochastic model. There are transition probabilities on the arcs, which tell you how long you stay and produce that bit of sound. And there are emission probabilities which say when you're producing that sound, what does that 18-dimensional vector look like? Right? That's the acoustic model. And then there's a mathematical expression there which says this is the definition, or this is the assumption about how this model works. Namely that the successive states you have a Markov process. You simply say where I go next depends only on where I was before, not on how long I was there. So whether I finish my and continue to say the of and, the n of and, doesn't depend on how long I've said I. I might stay longer, or I might leave early. I don't care how long I've said a. That's a silly assumption, but it's okay. It's mainly for computational reasons, right? So we do that. So this is the hidden Markov model. And this product over time going I going 1 through n gives you the total probability of an n-length sequence of acoustics jointly with the underlying state sequence, which corresponds to what's being said. So the state sequence itself is also n-length long, but the boldface S, the values it takes depends on what's being said. So the words being spoken tell you what kind of boldface S sequences are legitimate that correspond to words and so on and so forth. So this is the HMM. So there are several issues that come up, and there's a reason why people like HMMs. One of them is, what if I wanted to compute the probability of A given W? Remember, this is my probability calculation for the acoustic model, right? So to compute P of A given W, now remember, W is going to be R only something. So there are going to be phonemes. There's going to be this composition. By the way, the first thing you notice is that the nice thing about HMMs is if I have a HMM for every phoneme, I can string together an HMM for a word simply by stringing together the HMMs of phonemes. I can string together HMM for a sentence by stringing together the HMMs of the words. So this compositional nature of HMMs is very likely. The big thing is still an HMM. It's still a state machine whose states are still the same set of states, and you go through them temporally and so on. Everybody okay with this? All right. So the first problem is, how do you compute the probability of the acoustics given just the word sequence? What do you mean just the word sequence? Well, I didn't tell you S. I didn't tell you how long I dwelt in the first phoneme and the second phoneme and the third phoneme and so on. I just told you these words are spoken. So I could go through the phonemes initially very quickly and then dwell a long time on the later phonemes, or I could go slowly to the first part and quickly finish the second part and so on and so forth. Right? So all those things are possible. So that's what is there in boldface S. Boldface S says, how are you pacing through the parts of the words? Right? And there are many ways to pace through the parts of the word sequence from beginning to end. And all those are possible S's, right? And you have to sum over all of them. So if you think of P of A given W, the probability of the acoustics observed given the word hypothesis W, I can write it as the joint probability of the acoustics and the state sequence, the state alignment given W, and I have to sum out this variable. So if I have P of A given C, I can compute it as P of AB given C by summing out all the B's, right? So that's what's happening. Now the sum, on the other hand, is interesting because this product, I just copied this from the previous page, right? It's probably A given S times ST given ST minus 1, where the state sequences all obey or respect the fact that the word sequence is W. So if I'm starting the second part of a, I'm not going to go to somewhere else. I'm either going to stay or produce the third part of the A. After the A, if the word is and, I'm going to go to the first state of N, not to some other thing, right? So that's what S is. S is constrained by W. There are, of course, exponentially many sequences. Because if there are, like I said, 100 states, and if there are 500 frames in the utterance, that's 100 to the 500, or 10 to the 1,000 possible state sequences. So the sum is non-trivial. However, there's a nice dynamic program to do it, and later in the second lecture, we'll go through that dynamic program. Right? It's called the forward-backward algorithm. In fact, just one part of it, the forward part, does most of all the work for you. Right? So this is why people like HMM. There's a nice dynamic program to solve this otherwise hairy problem. Right? Good. Second, nobody gives us these probabilities. Right? We have to come up with them. How do we come up with them? So how do you come up with the probability of a die coming up 3? How would you do it in real life? Reva? You'd roll the die a few times and no, you don't know the problem. The goal is you have to find the problem. Take something simple. How do you know the problem? How do you figure out the probability of a coin coming up heads if you don't want to assume it's half and half? A bunch of trials. You flip it and you count and take the ratios, right? Same thing. So if somebody gave me lots of state sequences, I said, this is exactly how long I was in the first part of an A, and the second part and the third part, this is how long I'd just count. After being in every state, how often do I go to the next state? What is its frequency? And just tally it up, and that would be my model, right? But it's hard enough transcribing speech in words. If I tell you transcribe it in phonemes and give me that little frame by frame value of which part of which phoneme I was in at every frame, not only is it hard, we actually done it. And it costs about $1 a phoneme. And you speak about 2.5 words a minute, 4 phonemes a word, so 10 phonemes a second. Sorry. So that's about $10 a second. So an hour of speech costs $36,000 to transcribe at that level of detail, right? So it's very hard. Luckily, people don't have to give you that. If they give you only word level sequences, there's a funny little algorithm. It's called the Baum-Welch algorithm. I won't go into too many details of this, even in the second part. All I'll tell you is a little bit about how it works. It's an instance of what's called the expectation maximization technique, right? So what you do is the following. You say, let me assume some alignment, doesn't matter what. Equal spacing, boom, 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 done. Based on that, let me just estimate what these emission probabilities are, what these transition probabilities are, right? Once I've got those, based on that, I'll figure out what the best alignment is. Wait a minute. You started with assuming what the alignment was. Yeah, that's okay. I just started with something. I'll estimate my probability because once I give you the alignments, you can compute P of A given ST, P of ST given ST minus 1, because I've exactly told you which state you are in at every time frame. But once you get a model, you'll see in a minute, you can figure out what the most likely alignment was. Do it again. You don't even have to make a hard decision about what most likely alignment was. You can say, what's the probability of this alignment versus that alignment? That's the expectation part. So this clever technique of iterating between knowing the alignment and computing the model parameters, namely the probabilities, or knowing the probabilities and computing the alignments and so on. If you go back and forth between them, you actually can show that this process converges to some meaningful model. Meaningful in the sense of likelihood, right? It's a good fit to the acoustics and the word transcripts that you've given. There's another reason people like HMMs. You don't have to have these detailed phoneme level alignments. You can just take word transcripts, be done with it, and train. All right, all good? So what is this business about finding the most likely sequence? Actually, this is a third computational thing with HMMs, which has a nice solution. So I said, let's find the most likely alignment, right? So if I want to find the W that, let's take a special case where you say we don't even have a language model. Let's say all word sequences are equally likely. How can I find the W that maximizes P of A given W once I give you a particular A, right? So I have to do this max over W of these probabilities. So remember, a particular word has a particular state sequence, a set of admissible state sequences. And with all those state sequences, I want to find out this probability. This, by the way, I've gone to string notation. So this boldface S is a whole sequence of states. And so there's the product of all the STs given ST minus 1. This is the product of all the ATs given STs. And this is the sum outside of that, right? So now I'm saying after sum over many, many possible alignment sequences, the sum of these two probability values. So the analogy to this is to think about a relay race, right? Who's the fastest relay team in the world? So you have each individual runner, and you add up all their times, and that's the time for your team. But to first approximation, the fastest runner determines the winner of the relay. So if you just take the maximum value in the sum, it's a good approximation to the maximizer of the sum itself. Not the value. The value of the maximum, of course, is just one of many, many elements. So the value of the maximum in the terms of that sum is not a good approximation for the sum. But if you're comparing two sums, then the maximum in one compared to the maximum in the other is a good tiebreaker of which sum is bigger, right? So if you make that approximation, then there's the max over all possible W sequences. And within that, the max over all alignments of the W sequence of this probability. So it's basically just a double maximum, max of something, right? So it's a max over a big space. So this problem also has an interesting and clean dynamic programming solution. You don't have to search through a gazillion possible word sequences, and for each word sequence, another Brazilian possible alignments, right? It's all done in one smooth move with a dynamic program. And that is called the Viterbi algorithm, right? So these are sort of the three core reasons why people love HMMs. By the way, speech is not the only place. In fact, they were not even invented in speech recognition. They came about in a number of different ways. I think the original work was done for cryptography. And there's a little story about the Baum-Welch algorithm that it was first invented or created or discovered in secret, so nobody published anything about it. And then many years later, Baum, who had interacted with those people, published a paper. And then several years after that, the people who had it in secret said, oh, wait a minute, we had it before, we'll declassify it and let the world know that we came up with it first. And Welch was the primary guy on the other one. So that result is now it's called the Baum-Welch algorithm. Baum had the first openly published paper, Welch had the first actual paper, and they were collaborators, basically. They were not antagonistic or anything. So it's a Baum-Welch algorithm. Okay, that was the acoustic model, right? We use HMMs, somebody gives us word plus transcripts. Based on that, we can figure out the probabilities of the model, the P of A given S and the ST given ST minus ones. We can compute probabilities of P of A given W. We can find the most likely path. Good point. Language model. Again, same idea. You say, how do I find the probability of a word sequence? Well, to first approximation, I can say, again, use a Markov assumption. Assume that the probability of the tth word, first of all, the probability of word sequences can be decomposed. Probability of W1, W2, Wn, like Kevin told you yesterday, is P of W1 times P of W2 given W1, 3 given 1 and 2, 4 given 1, 2, and 3. And then you truncate your histories. Yeah, things really don't depend on words way far back. Let's stop after 2, for example. You can stop after 3, 4, some n, right? If you do that, you get a Markov approximation to the actual probability, and that's your P of L. And these are often called n-gram models. N is the number of words in this formula, right? So this is a trigram model, depends on the last 2 words. A bigram would depend on just the previous word. A 4-gram would depend on the last 3 words, and so on. And how do you estimate these particular probabilities? Well, again, counting. If you want to know the probability of dinosaur following the big purple, right? The big purple dinosaur. You go to a corpus, you find all instances of the 4-gram the big purple dinosaur. And while you're doing it, you also count how many times you simply see the big purple. And you take the ratio of the 2. That's the probability of dinosaur given the big purple. Okay, how many of you know the big purple dinosaur? Do we want to sing a song? No, sorry, I don't need. This is Barney. All right, so, but of course, this has a problem. Because if you think about it, if I have a 1,000-word vocabulary, how many 2-word histories are possible? 1,000 squared, right? So there are 1,000,000 possible histories. Let's say that some words are frequent, some are rare, right? If I take 2 rare words, how often do I expect to see them over here? Much less than 1 in a million, probably 1 in a billion or 1 in a trillion. Okay, let's say I say 1 in a billion. So relatively rare words, their combination appears only once in a billion. You have to get an estimate of the vocabulary of 1,000 words. So think of a 1,000-faced die. If I told you, get me probabilities on this 1,000-faced die, how many times would you like to roll the die? Is 5 enough? No. How about 1,000 times? You have 1,000 faces. Is that enough? No. How many? Million? So you have a million possible histories, and you want to get million possible futures out of them. So you want a million possible instances of each history. Now we're talking trillions of words. So even a simple trigram model is not easy to estimate because you'd never have enough data to see all the events that you care about. So what happens if I've never seen dinosaur following the big purple? Well, the model assigns it probability 0, which is not fair because it's not exactly an illegal word sequence, right? How about the word sequence the? You'll say, nobody says that, but I just did. So pretty much everything has to be allowed. You can't rule anything out for sure, right? That means that this probability f of wt given t minus 1, this f, by the way, represents relative frequency, just counting. How often did wt, a particular word wt, follow the particular words wt minus 1, t minus 2, right? So this often can have zeros. Oh, but how about if we simply count how often dinosaur followed purple? Or how often just the word dinosaur appeared in the corpus? Or just 1 over the size of the vocabulary, right? If you interpolate these 4, you get a much more smooth model. Smooth in the sense that now no probability is 0, because at the very least, this is never 0. Pretty much every word has some chance of being seen. So this is zero, non-zero for most words, and so on and so forth. So these are called interpolated models. There's a whole bunch of literature on how to build models of this class, which are better or worse in some way or the other. In fact, people measure performance by, Kevin said it yesterday, what do you measure performance of a language model by? Perplexity. You try to figure out what the model will do to some held out text, right? So there's a lot of literature on it, and we can talk more about it another time. I'm not going to do that today, right? So we now know the acoustic model, we know the language model. Remember, there's a third problem in speech recognition, which is search. You look over all possible word sequences. So actually, the Viterbi part that I mentioned earlier also plays a role in solving this third part, right? And in fact, there are a couple of other things that get used. So this idea that we have a large vocabulary which has many words in it is fine. What you then do is you think about your language model. Let's say we stick with a simple bigram language model, not even a trigram, right? I have probabilities to words given the previous word. What I can do is I can build a graph. Each node in the graph is a word. It represents a history. It represents WT minus 1. And from that word, I'll put arcs to every other state, saying if A was followed by banana, then I'll put an arc from the node for A to the arc for banana and put on that the probability of banana given A, right? A followed by, I don't know, computer. I'll take an arc from the word node for A to the node for computer and put on that the probability of computer given A. Now I get a graph. It has V nodes, where V is the size of the vocabulary. Each node has V outgoing edges, so that's V squared edges. And this whole graph is kind of manageable. By the way, there won't be V squared edges because, like we just said, we'll never say every word followed by every other word. So A might not be followed by serendipity ever. So you do some things to take care of those. Those are details. Let's not worry about it, right? So that's a graph. And now what I can do is every edge that had a word in it, I'm going to replace it with a sequence of edges. Banana is spelled B-A-N-A-N-A. So that one arc becomes a chain of 6 little arcs. And each of those arcs now has a phoneme on it. So this is composition. I just expanded my word graph into a phoneme graph. Then I'm going to go further. Each of those little edges that has a phoneme, I'm going to replace them with that little 3-state HMM. Remember, those are edges and nodes. So now I have a bigger graph with many, many nodes, many, many more edges, right? And now each node in that graph is a subphonetic unit. It's a piece of a phoneme. And those phonemes, one after the other, are pieces of a word. And the words are in this whole language model graph. So this big, gigantic graph that I get, you can think about it as something called a finite state acceptor, right? These are just other formalisms. I won't get into them today, but just think of it as a big graph with nodes and edges, where nodes have the significance of, like, signifying pieces of phonemes or pieces of words or sequences of words. And then the edges all have that probability of A given S. Remember, after all, this graph is going to explain the acoustics. And what you want to do is you want to take this graph, take the acoustics given to you, and now carry out that Viterbi calculation. What's the most likely state sequence through this graph given my acoustics? And you essentially get a sequence of arcs, which is a sequence of pieces of phonemes, which is a sequence of phonemes, which is a sequence of words, and boom, there's your answer, right? So that is what happens with all these finite state techniques, right? So you use a lot of these ideas, you do some heuristics, there's some business with determinization, minimization of the graph, and so on and so forth. The net result of it is you get a more or less tractable problem. Okay, so remember, what are the steps? Get some transcribed speech and words, do that forward-backward algorithm, figure out P of A given ST, figure out P of ST given ST minus 1. Oh, by the way, get a dictionary from somewhere because you'll need to know how words are pronounced as phonemes. And then get some text, estimate a language model, P of WT given WT minus 1. Then take this language model, build up a big graph of nodes being histories and arcs being the next word, put probabilities on that graph, replace the word arcs with phoneme arcs, replace the phoneme arcs with HMM arcs, determinize, minimize the whole big graph. Now you've got this graph in which, starting with a start node, ending with an end node, there are many, 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 many paths. You get some acoustics, find the most likely path through this graph given the acoustics, and read out the word sequence. That's your speech recognition solution, right? So what is P of A given ST? it has to be a probability distribution on one of those 13, 18 dimensional vectors given some piece of some phoneme. What's used to model that? Multivariate Gaussian. Mixture of Gaussians, whatever, right? So that's what was done for many, many years. And it was a state of the art until 8 years ago, right? So not too long ago. Remember, we started in 1962 with Raj Reddy's thesis. So this is how speech recognition was done for a long time. Questions? So I think I have a few more slides from that old Minnesota talk. How good was state of the art at the time? Actually, let me not do that. Let me say, so any questions? How to build acoustic models, how to build language models, how to put together the whole search graph, how to run Viterbi decoding, how to recognize speech. All good? Any comments? Too crazy? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. So let me make it very concrete, right? So let's take this formula over here. Let's deal with a simple language model because we don't want to get too complicated, right? Let's even forget this trigram and bigram part. Let's just say we have a unigram model that assigns probabilities to individual words based purely on relative frequency. I take my corpus, I count, and the probability of a word is number of times appeared in my corpus divided by the length of my corpus, right? Unfortunately, my corpus doesn't cover my whole vocabulary. So there will be some words for which P of F given WT is 0, right? This model is dumb. It just gives uniform probability to everything in my vocabulary, right? Now let's take some new word sequence, some real text from somewhere else. And let's just assume that that text has one or two of these words that were not seen in my corpus, right? What is the probability of that text under this model? 0.05, 0.19, 0.00, 3, 0.005, 0, something, something, 0, boom. The whole probability is 0, right? So according to this model, that string has infinite perplexity because perplexity is like, 2 to the minus log of the probability. So the probability is 0, log probability is minus infinity, minus log plus infinity, 2 to the infinity is infinity. So if I take the f of WT, the perplexity of the string is infinite. If I take my uniform model, let's say the string is 6 words long, it's 1 over v to the 6. If vocabulary is 1,000, it's minus 1,000 to the whatever, like 1 over 1,000 to the 6th. It's whatever, 1,000 million, billion, trillion, I don't know, some really, really tiny number. Right? Okay, both are pretty bad perplexities, right? I can say lambda 0 plus lambda 1, let's say they sum to 1. I have one free variable now. It's a one variable equation, right? I interpolate the two and I say, take the data, the 10-word sequence you have, take those two probabilities and start changing the value of lambda until the probability of that becomes highest, right? And it won't be at lambda 0 equals 0 because the other model gives 0 probability to the string. It won't be at lambda 0 equals 1 because that's a really low probability. The real maximum will be somewhere in between. So you have optimized your language model. It's a one-parameter language model. Actually, no, it has more than one, but the rest of the parameters are fixed by the data. There was only one parameter that was left for you, right? And so you optimize that to maximize the likelihood of that word sequence or alternately minimize its perplexity. So that's what I mean by saying language models are optimized for perplexity. You can do it with this big model. Now it has 4 parameters. There are models with thousands of parameters. Your recurrent neural net has millions of parameters, but the game is the same. You maximize the likelihood of some held out data. Right? Okay, all good? Any other questions? All right, so let me quickly tell you what the state of the art was, and then we'll take a break. So back in 2000, when I gave this lecture, touch-tone menus worked almost perfectly. You could just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 9, whatever, and it got it. Call classification, I put a little asterisk over there because people said 90, 95% because that's what seemed reasonable. But it turns out in hindsight that AT&T would never give us a number, by the way. They wouldn't publish what their accuracy was. They just said call classification accuracy was better than human operators. Part of the reason being a human operator listens to you, thinks for about half a second and then says, okay, you must want this, and puts you somewhere, right? Computers are much more cold-blooded that way. Like, okay, he said this word, didn't say that word. Probability 0.7 this, 0.3 that. Okay, I'm going to send him over there. Or 0.53 this one, 0.44 that one over here, right? So computers end up doing better. Interactive voice response systems. These we did get from the ATIS program. We got numbers. And you could have an almost seamless travel booking experience at 90% accuracy. Of course, you could do it only when the computer was in charge. It would be like, so Paula, where do I want? Like, Paula, I want to go to. Where do you want to go? I want to go see my parents, but I want to go to. No, where do you want to go? Oh, okay, Athens. All right, when do you want to go? I don't know. Maybe I should go after. No, when do you want to go? The first week of no, which day in August? 3rd. Okay, fine, August 3rd. So when the computer's in the driving seat at 90% accuracy, you have a great experience. But of course, like, these things didn't last very long. No, but they were pretty accurate because the vocabulary, remember, of these things is small. Desktop dictation, IBM, via voice, naturally speaking, towards the end of their existence, they were pretty good. Part of it is they trained on your voice. When you bought them, you installed them, you first had to read to them about 15 minutes or so. And they recorded your voice, figured out the patterns, did some adaptation, and so on and so forth. Broadcast news, even then, we used to transcribe at about 80-85% accuracy. Conversational speech was pretty bad. We were at about 65% accuracy, 30-35% word error rate. Universal voice interfaces are still too far away, right? That's where we were. So what are the big problems? Some of the problems, by the way, this is current as of 2000, right? Some of them were that these language models didn't have any syntax, they had this boring Markov nature. So we said, oh, we should be able to get something by putting language back into language modeling. Some syntax, some long-range dependence, and so on and so forth, right? This is still a problem today. Even the best language models today have only so much of long-range dependence. They lose track of what you're talking about. And I don't mean to sort of bore you with funny examples of GPT-4 or Llama. You can very quickly get them to go off track and forget what you're talking about, right? Okay, different scale of the problem. Here we're talking about not looking more than 3 words. Now we're talking not looking more than 300 words. The problem's still there. Pronunciations. A lot of the early work was done with native speakers of English or German or Japanese or what have you, French, right? Non-native speakers are always a problem. People who had any speaking disabilities or children. Today, Paula's big beef is speech recognition doesn't work for children. So that's partly because children pronounce things differently. They have a different cadence, all sorts of things. Acoustic model robustness, still a problem today, even today. Even somebody who makes devices like Alexa or Siri, HomePod, they say, hey, we need more research on speech. Microsoft is having a challenge, which we are helping them run. What is it called? Not so far challenge. So basically, it's speech recognition when the microphone is not so far. It's far, but not so far. There's still a problem today, acoustic conditions, right? All these are issues. Hypothesis search, like, real time is still an issue. We're getting better and better. Here, we probably made the most progress, partly because of GPUs and just like, between 2000 and 2024, the computing infrastructure is like, 3 orders of magnitude faster. So what used to be 100 times slower than real time, meaning 100 seconds to recognize a second of speech, is now 10 times faster than real time. And that advance is nothing due to us researchers in this room. It's all due to people somewhere else who just made chips faster and memories bigger and so on and so forth. Right? So let me stop here. Well, I have a few examples, but I'll play them later. So let me do this. Let me take a break here, 15 minutes, and we'll resume at 10:30 and go over the second part. I'll just put up the title so that you can see what the second part of the talk is. It's neural methods in speech recognition. All right. Okay. So any last questions before we break? John, you can get going. No worries. Questions? No? Yep. Did I hear a question? No? Okay. All right. Okay. Let's take a break. We'll resume in 15 minutes and we'll do neural methods. Hey guys, let's settle down. While people are settling in, I'm going to play some fun examples of audio just to tell you why speech recognition remains a fun and interesting problem, right? So the first one is just to show you how spontaneous speech is different from like, well-articulated speech. And this is actually an easy example. Things get much harder than this. So let's listen to this one.
Would it be something to have a World Series between?
Yeah. So the guy is saying, wouldn't it be something to have a World Series between? Like, he's talking probably about there was a Subway World Series where two New York teams are up against each other, some of that, right? So he's saying, wouldn't it be something to have a World Series between, right? So you can listen to how he says between. Better still, listen to how he says wouldn't, the not part of wouldn't. So the not of wouldn't and the be part of between. So listen to this one.
Would it be something to have a World Series between?
Who heard the not? Who heard the be in between? Okay, let's try it again.
Would it be something to have a World Series between? Would it be something to have a World Series between?
So, people talk in all sorts of fun ways. They're completely understandable, no problem. So remember I said we paid $1 a phone, $10 a second or something for transcribing speech. This was a corpus, we paid $100,000, so we got a few hours of speech. And by the way, it was transcribed by Stephanie Shattuck-Huffnagel at MIT. I know a couple of you at MIT, so her lab did the transcription. Anyway, so no, actually, this one was Berkeley. This was John Ohala and company at XE. All right, anyway. So what we found is if you write down the words that people said, if you go to a dictionary and write down the phoneme sequence that they're supposed to say, and if you actually listen or compare it with what they actually said, the agreement is about 67%. That means a third of our phonemes are wrong, quote unquote wrong, right? And that's how normal people speak. It's totally understandable, no problem, right? So these are kind of things. So then there are other effects, and to show that, I'll have to go further out in this. Let me see how I can move through this quickly. So by the way, I'll play the first bit to tell you what this is. So
the following tape contains one example from each of the 17 in the SRI spontaneous speech corpus.
Okay, so what he's saying is the following tape contains examples of speech from the SRI spontaneous speech corpus, right? This is my colleague Mitch Weintraub. I recognize his voice even after 20 years. So what it is they got a bunch of people to speak spontaneously, and then they transcribed that speech carefully, and then they gave it back to them and said, hey, we want you to do two things. One, read your transcript back as if you're telling it to a computer. And two, try to be as spontaneous as possible. Try to be like you. They didn't give them the audio of what they did before. They said, speak the way you normally speak and try to say exactly these words, right? So what you're going to hear is you're going to first hear the computer-directed version. Then you hear the play-acted version. And then you hear the original, right? And I just wanted to listen. No, nothing to look for. Just see how people talk and think about how people talk to a computer versus act based on a script. They're not being spontaneous. They're acting, but they're trying their best, and how they actually are, right? And so here's some fun stuff to listen to.
For time, but not a whole lot where I'm competing against anybody. Just something where I'm for time, but not a whole lot where I'm competing against any. Just something where I'm for time, but not a whole lot where I'm competing against anybody. Just something where I'm.
So you can see here the difference. Like it's just gets sloppier. The timing is different. The amplitude is different. All sorts of things change. The next one's a fun one. This is a person who talks somewhat fast.
I've just been to Mexico, but quite a few times because I grew up in Southern California, so we'd go down there a lot. But my sister's been down all the way through Mexico and into Guatemala even, which she really liked, but she speaks Spanish really well.
So this is her reading.
I've just been to Mexico, but quite a few times because I grew up in Southern California, so we'd go down there a lot. But my sister's been down all the way through Mexico and into Guatemala even, which she really liked, but she speaks Spanish really well.
That was trying to be natural, and this was the original take.
I've just been to Mexico, but quite a few times because I grew up in Southern California, so we'd go down there a lot. But my sister's been down all the way through Mexico and into Guatemala even. which she really liked. But she speaks Spanish really well.
You can see she really likes, yeah, which she really likes. Yes, okay. So this is what makes spontaneous speech much harder. And there are some absurd claims out there, and you should not believe them at face value. So Microsoft several years ago announced that they could do speech transcription better than humans. What they did is they took some speech corpus which had been in existence for about 25 years and on which they'd been working for 25 years, a fixed test set, which had been transcribed by humans and which had been retranscribed by other humans carefully. And when the two humans were compared, they were about 5.5% apart. So they said human accuracy or error rate on this corpus is 5.5. And then after 25 years of work on that one test set, they got an error rate of 5%. And so they declared they can do superhuman speech recognition. That same system on a different test set is probably over 15% error rate, maybe 20, right? So yeah, it's good to get your story in the New York Times, right? Oh, by the way, IBM came back and said, no, you're wrong. We had humans transcribe it carefully, and our humans are only 4.5% error rate. So no, you haven't got human error. In other words, wrong argument, right? Okay, but the point is that speech can be quite hard even for humans. And in fact, there are some weird instances when machines do better. But be that as it may, we are nowhere near human level speech transcription in pretty much anything, right? So take that as a pinch of salt. We've become very, very good, by the way, but not as good as humans. So I'll play you something else, which is indicative of this is indicative of dialect and other differences. So this tape comes to me. The previous one came from SRI. This one is from a colleague who passed away some years ago, Bill Labov, used to be at Penn. He was a social linguist. And one of the things he used to do is study language change over time and over geography. And he has a website, or used to have a website, I think it's still up, called the Phonological Atlas of North America. So he divides the US not by political boundaries, but by phonetic boundaries about how people speak. And he was the Henry Higgins of our time, right? And he could really tell you based on your speech which part of the US you grew up in and things like that. So he would send these surveys. He would send out a form and people would call him in. And he would say, read me a list of words, read me a list of sentences, have some spontaneous conversations. People would volunteer, and he would record it, transcribe it carefully, and make comparisons. So what he did is he gave a talk here many years ago, actually at one of the workshops. In this tape, he plays first a word in isolation. Then he plays the word with a little bit of context, and then he plays the whole utterance. And I want you to listen to the word, and as soon as you hear it the first time, form a hypothesis of what the word is, and then keep listening to it. All right? Okay, here we go.
Black. Living on one black. Living on one black. Old senior citizens living on one black.
Right? Okay. So that's normal people like you and me speaking.
Sacks. Sacks. We're sacks. We're sacks. Yet we're sacks. No sandals.
All right? How many got that the first or the second time? Anyone? How many got it the third time? Okay. Some didn't get it even the third time. Let's play it again.
Yet we're sacks. No sandals.
What did you have to wear? Socks. All right, cool.
Tap. Tap. And the tap. And the tap. You get the TV and the tap, and then there's an empty cabinet on the bottom.
TV on the top. Right, okay. I should maybe skip. Well, you know what? I'll play one more and then I'll skip. My favorite is towards the end of the recording.
Relax. Relax. You want to relax? You want to relax? Oh yeah, you want to relax? and he got stuck in there, and I had to come out.
It's locks. Don't ask me how. I read the transcript. Some of the good ones are towards the end. Okay, here, let's go to this one.
Said what I said. My mother corrected me the other night. I don't know what I said.
What I said.
Study for a while.
Okay, guesses? Okay, that's a good guess. That's what I guessed. Okay, let's listen.
And I didn't know that there was such thing as an air pocket. And we kept going up and down in the air. And you get to a point where you're steady for a while. All of a sudden, you just take this massive drop.
All right, how many people give up on speech recognition now? So this is life, all right? Let's listen to the last one. It's not as hard.
The men's clothing store. Because I worked at Chess King, which is a men's clothing store, and I was just getting so burnt out with working there.
She was working at Chess King, which is a men's clothing store, right? Okay, so that's what is fun about speech recognition. All right, let's kill this. Do I want to save it? No, I don't want to save nothing. It's already saved. All right, so everybody ready for part 2? All right, neural methods. So let's go. Again, a quick recap for some people who came in just now. Speech recognition basically underwent this paradigm shift in the early 80s when we said, oh, let's just think about the speaker's mind producing some word sequence W, which goes through some stochastic channel, and what comes out, we do the spectral analysis, get these MEL, Kepstra, whatever, and treat that as a sequence of acoustic vectors. So it's a D by T tensor. T is time, D is the dimension of your feature vectors. And we'll pump this into this listener's mind, which acts as a decoder and tries to guess what went in. And that's the basic setup. And hidden Markov models became very popular for a long time. Part of it is that if you wanted to compute this acoustic model probability, what's the probability of hearing these acoustics given these words? By the way, people call these generative models. So these are generative models of speech. Then you'd write this as like, the probability of the acoustics and the underlying alignment of the phonemes with the acoustics given the words. And this needs to be summed out. And this is where the Markov assumption comes in. This can be decomposed as a probability of A given the state sequence or the alignment sequence, and the probability of alignment given the words. We can make the Viterbi approximation, which gets us here. And then this is the formula that we use for doing our speech recognition. The other thing that really helped a lot was these Markov models were very compositional. So if you go back to this formulation where you also have a language model in here, then P of A given W has this form that we just wrote, and P of W has just been copied over. We make the Viterbi approximation. Now, if you look at this probability, it's a product of 3 terms: the acoustic model probability, P of A given S, the lexical probability, which is often degenerate. There's only one way you assume a word is pronounced. You can have a few alternations. You can have the and the and things like that. And P of W, instead of maximizing the product, you can maximize the log of the sums. And this is where I told you, you can take this probability, this language model, convert into this big gigantic graph. You can convert the conversion of the words into phonemes, make that another transduction, another transformation process, and so on. And there are these finite state operations. I didn't get into them, but just know that they're there. If you want to read more, I'll give you pointers. And the composition of these things gives you this big giant graph over which you do best path. Best path is the same as the Viterbi algorithm. And then you figure out the words based on that, right? So this is where we left it when we stopped. So let's go into a little bit more detail about some of these things, all right? So I will have a few formulae. You'll have to follow me closely, so pay attention. Don't worry about taking notes if you don't have to. I know some people have to, because all these slides will be up on the web, right? Okay, so let's say in comes some speech, and the transcript is cat and hat. So what we do is we create a phonetic dictionary. And is pronounced a, na, de. Cat is pronounced ka, a, hat is pronounced her, a. Some phonemes get reused. So you see a in all 3 words. You see t in a couple of them, and so on. And for each of them, we create a little HMM. In the previous lecture, I had these 3-state HMMs. This time, I'm just going to have essentially one state because it's going to be just you emit that sound as long as you want, and then you move on. We're going to keep the illustration simple, right? Okay. So what we do is we create a composite HMM for the word sequence cat and hat by stringing together the phoneme model for k, a, t. Follow the color code. K is yellow, a is this, I don't know, red something. T is purple, red again, cyan, pink or magenta, green, red. Okay. And if you look at it again, once you string these together, this is still an HMM. The dotted lines, by the way, are meant to be null arcs, meaning on these arcs, you actually produce an acoustic frame, one of those vectors of acoustics. And so there's a probability associated with them. The dotted ones just assume that you move through without producing anything. So what you do is you construct the structure to compute various probabilities. So first, I'm going to tell you how to do the forward probability calculation, the total probability of acoustics given words, right? The dynamic program. So you construct what is called a lattice. So if you notice, I took the composite HMM on top and laid it down here vertically, right? So there's a curve here, that's the yellow ones, then the red ones, the purple, the red again, blue, pink. And instead of having the self loops, I've unrolled it in time. So I took my HMM, which is a static structure and where time is something you do by walking through it. And instead I unrolled it, well, just for you this way in time, right? And so therefore now on the x-axis here is time, the speech. And I'm going to take this little bit of speech and produce a vector here, this little bit of speech and produce a vector here. So there's going to be an acoustic vector at 10 millisecond intervals. And this is the model of that speech. So what the hidden Markov model does, let's say somebody gave me the probabilities, P of A given S and P of ST given ST minus 1. At this time, some Y1 is observed from the acoustics, from the speech. It's a vector of size 18, 30, whatever. And then each of these models assigns it a probability. So the probability of Y1 given K, probability of Y1 given A, probability of Y1 given T, probability of Y1 given N, probability of Y1 given D, and so on, right? Okay. This is done for all of them from Y equals 1 through N. Right? And in particular, we can focus on one of them in the middle and say, okay, so this is some, is it small t? What is it? Yeah, yi. So at time index I, the acoustic observation is some vector yi, and this is the model assigned probability for that vector under all the models I have, all the P of A given S's I have, right? Okay. So what do I want to do with it? So here's the composite model again. I'm just moving them aside so I have some space to write some equations. Right? Okay. So here is one way to produce these acoustics. You say cat and hat real quick, and then you dwell on the T for a long time. Right? So here I'm going through K. Remember, when I go along one of these, I produce acoustics of that sound. So here I'm producing the acoustics of a N. And over here, all these acoustics belong to the T. Or I can go real slow in the beginning, hang on to the K as long as I want, and then quickly produce the rest of them. So I could articulate this word in 2 different ways. By the way, this is not possible because if I stayed this long producing a K, I would never have enough time to finish. So I'm just keeping them there for you to see, but in terms of feasibility, those are unreachable states, right? So if you think of graphs and connectivity, if you want to look for a path that goes from here to here, it'll never go through this, right? So and this, for example, is a typical path through this, right? So I might produce K for one frame, A for one frame, T for another frame, another A for one frame, another N for one frame, and so on and so forth, right? And here I produce the last A for a couple of frames instead of just one. Or actually 3 frames, 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, so this is a typical path. And what do I need to do? I have these probabilities, and I need to compute the forward probability. I want to compute the probability of the entire Y sequence, the entire sequence of vectors at the bottom, given just the word hypotheses, namely the phoneme sequence. So I don't want to assume any particular state sequence, which means I don't want to assume any of these paths is the correct one. I want to sum over all the paths. So can you all see now what this S, the set of possible S's is? So once I have a W and the length of the sequence, it tells you the set of sequences that are feasible, right? And they're all between that purple and yellow band. So any one of those is okay. Everyone with me? So what I need to do is, on any one of them, the probability computation is simple. I just multiply the numbers along the way. Boom, 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 boom. Or if I'm storing log probabilities, I just add them up along the way. Right? Okay. That part is easy. The tricky part is there are many, many paths over here, right? At every point, you have a choice of this way or that way, this way or that way. Of course, they recombine two in the end, but there's still a very large number, right? But now think of it this way. I need to get the total probability from the top to the bottom, right? Actually, but let's now say, what are all the ways to, let's say, let me walk you through this. Let's assume for a moment that I knew all the probabilities of reaching these states. In other words, I knew the probability of all the paths that come to this state over here that I'm pointing with the mouse, right? So I could come to it this way, I could come to it that way, and so on and so forth. Let's say I knew the probability any one column. You all with me? How do I know that? Don't ask me yet. Just assume I know it. All right? So now, can I figure out the probability of coming to this blue state over here? All the paths that come to the blue state, not just any one. Well, how many ways can I get to the blue state? I can either get to it from the left by this horizontal path, or I can get to it from above by starting from this state and going down here. So in fact, to get to this blue state over here, there are only two ways. So if I knew all the ways I could get to this state over here, and I knew all the ways to get to this state over here, the probability of getting here and the probability of getting here, I could simply take the probability of this blue state times this probability and add it to the probability of this red state times these two probabilities. And that would give me the probability of all the paths that come to this state. So I just pulled a little trick on you. I said, imagine if you know the probability of all the paths that come to any one of these states in the first column. If I know that, then I can compute the probability of coming to any one of those states in the next column. And it's not a super duper crazy computational thing. What is the size of the computation? The size of the in degree of this node, right? For each term in here, I have to take a probability of where it's coming from, multiplied by the arc probability. I get a bunch of these and I add them up. So the number of arcs coming into this state decide how much computation I need for this state. And I do this for every state. So what's the computational cost of going from the first column, where I know all the probabilities of getting to that state, to the probability of all the paths coming to the next column of states? It's just the number of edges between those two columns, right? And how many edges are there? Size of the HMM, right? So that's how. So if I gave you all the probabilities in this column with computation proportional to the number of arcs, you could compute all the probabilities in this column, and then you just recurse, right? So what's the probability that a path starts here? 1, because we know the first word is cat, and so it starts. What's the probability that you get over here? We know that. That's what we want to calculate, because we want to calculate the probability of these acoustics, given that the word sequence is cat and hat, right? So basically, you can start with setting this to 1, everything else to 0 down here, propagating forward column by column, like I just told you. What's the total computation? The number of arcs in this graph. What is that? Some constant times time. And that constant depends at most on the square of the number of states. In this picture, actually, it's linear in the number of states, because the in degree of each arc, each node rather, is just a fixed number. But in general, the in degree of a node in the state could depend on the number of nodes in the previous column. So basically, S times T, S is the size of the state space, times T is the length of time, or S squared times T, N rather, will give you the complexity of this whole computation. Remember, we thought it was S to the N. So no, it's not S to the N, it's just S times N, or S squared times N, right? So that's what the dynamic program is. That's what does this, right? So this is what I was trying to tell you about, how it's straightforward with HMMs to compute this marginal probability. Same thing with the best path. Suppose I wanted to find the probability of the best path from the top left to the bottom right, right? So what I can do is I can say the best path from the top left to the bottom right, if I look at wherever it goes, let's say this green path is the best one, if it goes through here, then what is the best path from this node to the end? It has to be the rest of this path, because otherwise there would be a shorter path. So using this property that the shortest path, its suffix is the shortest path to the destination, you can pull the same trick. You can say, if I told you the best path from this state to the end, can you figure out the best path from all the other states to the end? You say, okay, well, if the best path from the end goes here, then the best path from here has to go through this or something here, and so on and so forth, and you do the same recursion. So it's exactly the same recursion. You start from left to right. You say, if I knew the best path to each of these states, let's say I knew the best path to here came from here, the best path to this guy came from here. I know the best path into each of the states on the left, right? It is the same thing. I come to this blue state over here. I say I could come to this state from either this path or this path. I'll take the probability of the best path here times this, the probability of the best path here times this, and take the better of the two. That's the best path into this state. And it comes from here. How do you get there? Oh, for that, I just look at what's the best path to that state, and so on and so forth. So you can unroll the recursion backwards after you've figured out your immediate previous state. So this is basically the Viterbi algorithm. So in both cases, the best path, the path that maximizes the probability of the state sequence given the observed acoustics, which you can write this way, maximizes this product, and therefore you simply do it by this dynamic program, right? So basically, this is what makes HMMs fun. Now, compare these two guys, by the way. What do you see in the expressions that's similar or different? Anyone? What did you do? You just replace the sum with the max, right? So if you're slightly more mathematics-minded, you'll realize that sums and products form a semi-ring, and min and plus or max and plus also form a semi-ring. And min is just the sum operator in that semi-ring. And sum is the sum operator in the plus times the semi-ring of real numbers. Therefore, you can actually use exactly the same piece of code, just change the algebra, and the same algorithm finds you the best path instead of the total sum, or the other way around, right? So this is often used in the FST implementations. You can specify a semi-ring, and one semi-ring gives you the total probability of producing Y given the word sequence. The other one gives you the best path to produce Y given the word sequence, right? Totally trivial. In fact, if you like programming in C++, you can overload the operator. You don't even change the code, right? Okay, all right. Let's see what we're going to do next. So I wanted to set this up because I want to now talk about sort of the evolution of the world. Remember I said the model for the probability of the vector observed given this HMM state is a Gaussian or a mixture of Gaussians. So the first thing that happened is people said, well, we don't think these vectors are Gaussian distributed, right? So why don't we use a neural net to compute probabilities? And so the field went this way. So there was a paper in 2011 from Microsoft, which replaced that emission probability calculation, probability of Y given the HMM state, with a neural net, right? And they got this huge reduction in error rate on in fact, on the same famous switchboard corpus of conversational speech. They had like a 30-something% reduction in error rate, which was groundbreaking because most papers published would have 2, 3, 5% reduction here or there, right? And so people took notice. And that was sort of the acceptance of neural acoustic models in speech recognition, which happened around 2011, right? But just in case you think these guys came up with the idea, no. The first paper on using acoustic models, using neural nets to model acoustics, actually goes back to '88, right? So Alex Weibel, who's still a professor at CMU, he sort of did this work with Chicano, who was the head of the lab. Jeff Hinton was visiting CMU at the time, I'm told, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what is this idea? It's a simple idea. So the figure on the left is actually from Weibel's paper. The figure on the right is from one of my students' papers in 2015, where we used that idea and won a worldwide competition on speech recognition, which had a $30,000 prize. My students were very happy until they found out that the university gets the prize. But anyway, it did pay for their conference travel and stuff. So here's what happened. So Alex Weibel said, we'll take about, they were doing phoneme recognition, right? So you get a cutout, simple clip, one phoneme, and you recognize what it is. Even better, the phoneme was either b, d, or g. That's it. So three-way classification, right? So they took about 15 frames, remember 10 milliseconds per frame, 15 frames, so that's about 150 milliseconds of speech. They were using 16 Mel scale filter bank coefficients. All sounds familiar now that I've been talking about it for an hour. And so they took this whole thing as input and did something very simple. They took a 16:3 kernel, convolution, produced an output, built 8 such kernels. So they take this block and produce an 8-dimensional vector. Slide that kernel over, do it again. Slide it over, do it again. Oh, sorry, this way for you, right? Okay, so that's what they did. And now you get a hidden representation, which is 8-dimensional. and whose frame rate is about the same as what's here. It's a little bit shorter because, like, you lose a couple of frames on the edges or something. Do it again. Take 5 frames times 8, so that's a 8 by 5 kernel. Produce a number here. Do it again and again, 3 times, now 3-dimensional, right? And then a fully connected layer, actually not fully connected. This whole row gives you the probability. It's a feature for D, B, and G, and then they do a softmax, right? Super big network, isn't it? They had to go to the supercomputer in Tokyo to run this. Took them about a day to train, which is what it takes for you to train a model today with GPS. So that hasn't changed in our research. We still train models that take about a day or 2 to train because we can't wait much longer than that. All right, so we did this in 2015 again. We took, I think, 40-dimensional Kepstra, maybe 80-dimensional, I don't remember. We took 20-something frames instead of 15. We had 5 or 6 layers instead of 3. We had, again, we had convolutional kernel size 5. We did this clever thing, not super clever, about downsampling in time, because you really don't need that much temporal resolution. We put these temporal connections. We made it a little bit like an RNN thingy. Yeah, sure. Who thinks these two are fundamentally different things? If you do, I'm going to ask you for money because maybe you believe everything I tell you. Anyway, so now this is basic stuff, works very well. And essentially, this is more or less like what the Microsoft guys did. A little bit different. I didn't think they had the temporal connections, but that's basically what they did. And so the difference between 1988 and 2011, anyone wants to enumerate? Data. They trained on 2,000 hours, whereas Weibel trained on maybe 5 minutes or 10. Computing. And don't underestimate the last one, optimization algorithms. We've made a lot of progress in doing good optimization, right? And that's the difference. And so in 1988, it was just an oddball idea. Some Japanese dudes were doing it. And then in 2011, it was like, oh, we got to do that, right? So that's what we started doing. So let me sort of set up over here a little bit of more detail. So here is the acoustics processing going on. You're producing these 15-dimensional vectors. You get one of them every 10 milliseconds. And let's again go with cat and hat. So our word sequence is cat and hat. And I know, by the way, this yellow stuff is meant to give you a time alignment. So these are the 3 frames corresponding to the K. These 4 are the A. These 2 blue ones are the N. Sorry, the T rather, the purple. And this is A, N again, the 4 frames here are the H, hat, and T, right? So I take my neural network and I say, hey, when you get this as your input, and maybe I don't give it just 1 frame, I give it like, the adjacent 3 or 5 or some number of frames. That's what this picture is supposed to be a cartoon of, right? I take the acoustics around here and say, hey, the sound over here is an A, right? So this A is flashing. So that's a training of the neural network, right? I go somewhere else and I give it this example as an input. So this is the example over here with this frame at the center. And I say this one is a ha. So now the H is flashing. So this is how you create all the examples for your neural net. Here's a bunch of input frames. Here's the output label. Go train, right? So this is the standard way of training. How do you get the labels, by the way? You have to get this alignment. So in the early days, how did you get the alignment? You build a Gaussian-based system. You align the speech every frame, and then you fed that to the neural network. So no, these things weren't getting rid of Gaussian models. They were just using them to do something better. Right? Okay, it won't stay for very long. It'll change, but still. What these things did, though, is they produced phoneme posterior probabilities. So they gave you essentially the probability of the phoneme label given the acoustics, right? But what we need for our, and by the way, so when you do the optimization, you do something like this. People nowadays call it cross-entropy training. At each frame I goes 1 through n. You try to maximize the probability of the most likely, as you determined it, the correct phoneme label given the input. And you sort of maximize the sum of these log probabilities. That's your training objective. And people call it the cross-entropy objective, right? Or minimize the negative of the log probability. But what we need in our HMM system, remember, is a generative model. We need the probability of the acoustics given the label. That's what goes into that trellis on every arc so that you can do your forward and backward calculations every Turby. So how do you do that? people used a very simple idea. They just said, if you want the probability of y given a phoneme phi, simply take the probability of the phoneme given y that comes out of the neural network, plug it into this formula, and ignore the PYI because that's just a scale. Because remember, we're trying to maximize things overall. We're trying to find the most likely phoneme sequence. The acoustics are fixed. And then this one, where do you get it from? Just count up in data. Take some transcribed speech, align it, count how many frames each phoneme occupies, normalize by the number of frames, and that's your quote unquote prior. So you take your neural net output, which is a posterior probability, you scale it with your priors, forget about the P of yi term, and pretend that that's a likelihood. And people who are a little bit more formalist, it's a pseudo likelihood, it's missing a scale, that's okay, whatever. So this is what got used in the Microsoft papers, and this is what we ended up using in our lab, and that's what won us our competition in 2015. So these are the good things that happened in acoustic modeling, right? Okay. But let me go with this one more time with a slightly more detailed thing. So what happens if I don't want to commit to an alignment? What happens if I don't want to give my acoustic model, the neural net, when I'm training it, I don't want to give it just one label per frame because I don't know what is what, right? What I know is the person said cat and hat, right? So what I've done is I've enumerated on top all the possible alignments for cat and hat. So the k followed by at is the yellow line on the top of that picture where you stay in k as long as you want and then finish the rest quickly. The bottom one is cat and hat. That's the lower one. So these are all and this is everything in between. So I've got all the sequences that could possibly be the correct labels, meaning at any given frame, I don't know that the label here is a k. It could be a k, it could be an a, it could be a t, depending on which one you're talking about. So let's just say for starters, that I don't know what the correct label is, right? So I don't know what the correct label is over here. It could be a k, a, or t. I don't know what the correct label here is, but it can't be a k. It has to be a h, a, or t, right? So, but these are all the possibilities. The possibilities are given by enumerating all the sequences and seeing at each column in time, what are the possible values, right? So all of these are correct answers. Now how do I train my neural net? It's no longer as simple, here's the right label. It's not a classification problem anymore. This is a sequence training problem, right? Okay, so what we want to do is we want to maximize the probability of the sequence k, a, t, a, and so basically we want to maximize the sum of all these sequences, the probability of the sum of all these sequences. So the red T over here at the bottom, the bold-faced T which indexes the sum, it basically runs over these sequences. Whereas bold-faced T goes T1, T2, T3, you're going through all these sequences. And for each of them, I'm still going to do the same thing. I'm going to pretend as if the neural net assigns a probability to the output phoneme that corresponds. So T sub I is the ith phoneme in the sequence bold-faced T. Right? Are you following me? So this T sub I is the ith phoneme, I being in time index 1 through n in this bold-faced T. So I'm going to take whatever neural net probability is assigned to that phoneme, and I'm going to multiply that along I going 1 through n, meaning I'll multiply the probabilities along this sequence or that sequence. And what I want to maximize is the sum of all these probabilities. That's my training objective. So it's no longer cross entropy. Everybody with me? So if you do this properly, what you're trying to maximize is the likelihood of the correct word sequence, phoneme sequence, regardless of alignment. So bold-faced phi is just a phoneme sequence, no alignment implied. So there are only 9 phonemes in that sequence, not 25, which is the number of frames, right? So I can take P of phi given y, and instead of maximizing that, I can maximize its log. And instead of maximizing its log, I can say, let me take the joint probability of y and phi times the probability of y, and factor it back as probability of y given phi times P of phi, and so on and so forth. And then, since phi is fixed now, remember, I'm training. I can forget about that and simply maximize this, because the neural net doesn't affect phi. It only affects the likelihoods of the calculation of P of y given phi and so on, right? And I know how to get P of y given phi because I just gave you a formula earlier. So now you can do it this way, and the denominator now has a P of y. So how do you get P of y? You sum over all other sequences that are possible. So this big phi is the correct transcript. This phi tilde in the denominator is any other transcript. Yeah, it's a whole wild space of possibilities, but there's a little trick one does. I won't get into that right away, but I'll tell you that this is what is done. And this objective is called maximum mutual information. if you do information theory, you'll realize that you can manipulate this formula, treat it as a mutual information between the phoneme sequence, no time alignment, just phoneme sequence and the acoustics. So if you want to maximize the mutual information between the phoneme sequence and the acoustics, this is what you should be maximizing. So this is called the maximum mutual information training objective, right? It turns out this was not to neural nets, nothing new to neural nets either, because we had a paper just a couple of years earlier, around that time, where we said we can do this for actually, okay, first, maximum mutual information training. I think people had known about it for a long time. The first papers using that for speech recognition date back to 96. That was the year I started working on speech, right? So old ideas. It's just that in 2016, we figured out how to apply this to neural nets, right? And this paper is quite well cited. And basically it says you can train neural nets directly for sequence valued targets. You don't have to get a frame by frame phoneme target. So what this paper did is it got rid of the need to produce an alignment. Right? So now we don't need a Gaussian mixture-based model to first get the time alignments so that our neural net has specific targets. You can just take the phoneme sequence, take the acoustics, and train. Right? Okay. So that was acoustic modeling. So these are the changes that happened. But we still used it, by the way, with the backend language model and the pronunciation lexicon and so on and so forth. In the meantime, we were also making progress on neural nets to estimate the language model. So again, Kevin talked about Joshua Bengio's paper about language models, neural language models. There were papers by Holger Schwenk around 2006. And Holger, he has some Bengio connection. I think he was either a postdoc in his lab for a few years. He's in France, now works for Meta, used to be at a university for a while. And before that, he used to be at this French National Research Lab called LIMSI. And so he did a bunch of work. This is a journal paper. He'd been working on it for a few years. And it was a very simple feed-forward language model. So this is like a 4-gram model. You take the 3 previous words, put them as input. You take the next word, make that your target. As simple as you can get in terms of conceptual formulation, right? Of course, the devil's in the details because the vocabulary is often thousands of words. So this could be a 1,000-dimensional vector. These could be gigantic matrices. The output is 1,000 output nodes or thousands of output nodes. We just said 10,000 is considered a medium vocabulary these days. So you have a neural net with 10,000 output nodes. So computing with them can be a bear. He figured out some of those problems, got everything to work. And these papers received a lot of attention. But again, you should give credit where credit is due. The original ideas go back to 89. Again, you'll see Chicano involved. He was the head of group at ATR at that time. And they had a very simple idea. They were trying to predict word categories, not even words, like part of speech tags, if you want to think of it that way. They had 89 categories. And they had a 1-hot encoding of the input, 89 units. 1-dimensional, by the way. When they say units, they literally mean 1 unit, 1 real valued number. And it was 0 or 1. And then they had 1 layer in here, fully connected, which is 16-dimensional, meaning there are 16 elements in there. 2nd layer, output. And they trained this network to predict word categories based on text. And they said, yeah, we know language bigrams is not good. We'll do trigrams. So they actually made 2 copies of it and had the hidden units over here go as additional inputs to this hidden unit. And this is the trigram model formulation. And if you stare at it a little bit, you'll see that it's more or less this. So again, they trained it on 89, a vocabulary of size 89, 3-layer network, did perplexity as the target. Holger, same thing, except this time he has thousands of words in his vocabulary, huge models, and this achieved a fair bit of success. So this is neural nets applied straightforwardly to language modeling. We're still in the n-gram world. By the way, earlier we were talking about how the relative frequency-based estimates give 0 probability to things. So that problem goes away with this because this network almost never gives 0 probability to anything. And there were early papers showing that the smoothing that this one does is pretty much as good as any tricks you can do with that interpolation or optimizing parameters and so on. So this was the beginning of that. Then in September 2010, we had another paper. This is Mikolov, who was a PhD student at Brno at the time. He was visiting me for a year and did the work here, and we wrote this paper. And he said, oh, how about we use a recurrent neural net? Instead of just getting inputs, 1 or 2 or 3 words, and predicting the outputs, let's have this hidden state, the narrow one that we had in the other picture, and save it from the previous time steps. Instead of having multiple words, we'll have the previous word and the rest of the history encapsulated as the previous state of the network. So this is a diagram he used. Nowadays, we use slightly different diagrams for the same thing. But this was his paper. And even he didn't think of this originally. There was a paper from Ellman in 1990. And in fact, in this paper, we called them Ellman networks because that's what the cognitive science community was calling them. So Ellman had exactly the structure. And he was doing language modeling, except his language was bits. And he was trying to figure out if you had a bit pattern where, let's say, there's a parity check bit. There are 7 bits, and the 8th one is simply the binary modular to sum of those things. Can this model figure that out? Or if you have alternating zeros and ones, can the model figure that out? Right? So Ellman was using these ideas for language modeling. His language had a vocabulary of 2. Ours had 5,000 or 10,000, something. But again, same thing. So this paper, just like the Microsoft paper, got everybody to look at acoustic models carefully with neural nets. This paper got people looking at language models with neural nets. Because even Holger Schwenk and his best models had to interpolate with n-gram models. He did some tricks where he said, I can't deal with a 10,000 word vocabulary, so I'll take the 500 most frequent words, call it my neural net vocabulary, and the remaining 9,500 words will be based on the n-gram model's prediction. This model will simply say, not these, one of those, and all sorts of things like that. And the performance was, a little bit better than n-gram models. Right? This one blew the n-gram models out of the water. And it was like, oh, darn, we have to look at this. So just like the Microsoft paper did stuff that made everybody look at acoustic models, this paper did stuff that made everybody look at language models and speech recognition, saying we need neural language models. Neither of them are new. Both of them date back to ideas in 89 and 90. Right? Okay. So this was Mikolov's model. Here's how nowadays we draw the pictures. We say, yeah, there is this word. It has a 1 hot encoding. So the 1 is hot. That's why it's glowing red. And then it goes in, and you get the previous state, and you combine the two. You get the current state of the model. From that, you predict WT minus 1. And that state from there goes in over here. WT minus 1 comes over here, and you predict WT. This picture is reasonably. Anyone not familiar with this picture? No? OK. All right. Marek, what is what do you want to know more about it? Should I explain more?
Just not familiar with this exact picture.
Okay. Okay. There are lots of little details. We can quibble about that. If you know the concept, that's probably more important. What would you do differently, actually?
Sorry?
What would you do differently other than this picture?
Well, I mean, probably I would do it very similar.
Okay. So let me maybe, yeah. Was this one familiar? Okay. So this picture comes from Ellman. So, I mean, Ellman's paper has a similar picture.
Just because I'm not in the speech domain. So
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, but I'm somewhat of a traditionalist in some sense. That's why when we wrote that 2015 prize-winning paper, we called it time delay neural networks. Everybody else in the world calls it a convolutional network. But that's just time. Okay. And this one also same thing. So, okay. So other than just the way it's drawn, the basic idea is straightforward, right? Or do you want me to go over it?
Yes.
It's okay. All right. Yep. Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. So that was 2010, right? Hermann Ney's group at Aachen, who, of course, being German, knew Schmidt-Huber and all the LSTM work, said, their neural net is weak ass. We'll do a better one. So they built an LSTM-based language model, right? So if you look at it a little harder, it's kind of almost the same thing, except for that pink stuff in the middle, right? So what it is instead of just using just the previous state as is, you have these 3 things they call gates. These are just weight functions that apply to the vector component-wise, and they kill them or amplify them. And the weights of these 3 gates are computed based on the input, not just the weight values over here. And that's what makes this thing a little bit more flexible. So just to give you an idea, one of the problems that RNNs had, Mikolov encountered it, others have pointed out before, is that when you train these using cross entropy, for example, you propagate the gradient back from here to the network weights. So some of the gradient flows back this way. In other words, the partial derivative of this output relative to this network weight can be done by the chain rule this way, but the same weight is used over here. So the derivative also flows back this way. And the same weight is used over here, so the derivative flows back this way. So imagine if one of these paths, the weight from beginning to end is less than 1. Then within a few steps, you get this geometric propagation, and the effect of the gradient just disappears. It doesn't, the gradient of this weight relative to, of the output with respect to this weight is almost 0 because of the, or the other way around, if this total step is positive, the next one is even more important, the next one, and the gradient of one of these nodes way back relative to this output is huge, and it might overflow. So there are all sorts of tricks you have to do to keep gradient magnitudes under control and so on and so forth, right? So these LSTMs were thought of as a way to overcome that. There are other reasons to think about them. And what that is that they have a through path. So the gradient from here to this node over here can go straight through these if all these gates have scaling factors close to 1, right? So things like that happen. And this model indeed performs better, right? So within 2 years of our paper, somebody is getting better results. That's okay. Like, because LSTMs are just a different kind of network, right? So these happened, and then that's basically how recurrent models came to language modeling, right? But in the meantime, so remember, the Mikolov paper was 2010, the Schluter, Herman Nye paper was 2012, the Chicano paper was 89. So this is a neural language modeling. In the meantime, other things were happening on the acoustic modeling side, which had to do with Alex Graves' work, right? So this is what people call connectionist temporal classification. So the way you want to think about this is, here are the acoustics, one frame at a time. And let's say the transcript is again cat and hat, and have the same old models, right? And so therefore, there's a composite HMM of cat and hat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of the neural net that is going to be trained with this. And let's say that if I do frame by frame training, for this frame, I have to say the phoneme is ah. For this frame, I have to say the phoneme is ha, and so on and so forth. And this gives me the posterior probabilities from which I can calculate the pseudo likelihoods and so on. So this is the cross entropy criteria, right? So if you look at this carefully, you essentially are maximizing or minimizing the negative log probabilities of these one frame at a time, right? So just for representation purposes, I'm going to not draw these big crazy networks in detail. I'm going to get a little bit more modern in my drawings. And I'm just going to draw a little block. So this little block means all of these guys, this block means all of these guys, and so on and so forth. CNN means they're CNNs, FC means is a fully connected layer. And then these are the output probabilities. So this purple arrow here might be doing a softmax, for example. Right? Okay, so I'm going to get rid of these. And of course, I apply this for every frame, and therefore I get this. So the normal cross-entropy training objective says, for each frame, give me the correct label, right? So Alex Graves, when he wrote his paper, he said, well, I don't want to do that. I want to sort of think about the phoneme sequence, cat and hat, and I want to allow all possible alignments of cat and hat, right? So he went about it a slightly different way in terms of exposition. So instead of saying, this is what we'll do, this is the cross-entropy objective, he said, I'm going to sum over all possible bold-faced T's. So bold-faced T, again, is all possible ways of realizing this phoneme sequence. His vocabulary is a little bit different, but you can think of it the same way. You can go through the k state as long as you like, then you go through the a, then you go through the t, then you go through the a again, then the n, and d, and so on and so forth. So basically, like, just different views of the same basic issue. So he said, let's sum over these T's. And he had a particular way of computing that loss. And he said, let's do it this way. So here is what you need to compute. So if you're an Alex Grave follower, you'll say, I'm going to do CTC loss. So the CTC loss is this quantity right here. Everybody happy with this? You've done this before? Anyone? Yeah, okay. What similarity does it? Yep, go ahead. Yes. Exactly. So the difference is that sum over bold-faced T. If that sum wasn't there, if I just took the most likely phi hat sub Ti, I would have cross entropy. Perfect. Okay, so this equation is the forward probability calculation for an HMM. Bold-faced T was all the paths, and for each path, you sum the emission probability times the transition probability on that arc, and you summed over all the arcs, and the negative log of that was what you did for the HMM. So anyone find these eerily similar? Yep. Yes. In fact, they're the same computation. All right. So we can use the same machinery to compute CTC loss. There's absolutely no code that needs to be written. Your old code will work just fine. So if you take my speech recognition class, that's what you do. In the first project, you implement the forward-backward algorithm HMMs. And in the third project, you use it to compute CTC loss. Same thing, right? So that's why when people first started talking about CTC, all of us were scratching our heads saying, is this different? What is different? Frankly, nothing is different. But I'll tell you what's different. That's true. So what happens is you have a yi, and the neural net produces probabilities in all these arcs, the posterior probabilities of the phoneme given yi. And then you need to sum over everything. So this is one possible path. So this boldface T could be this, either in this equation or this equation, either way. Or it could be one of those, or it could be something in between. I'm repeating this picture because I just want you to realize that we're doing the same computations, right? And therefore, if you do the forward probability, like remember all the incoming arcs, you sum their probabilities and propagate them forward from one column to the next column to the next. That's basically what happens. Okay, what's the difference? The difference is, in the HMM case, this is a generative model. We are computing the likelihood of the observed acoustics given the state, given the node in the graph, or the arc in the graph, actually. Think about it as arcs. It's better to think of them that way. Here, you're computing the probability of the arc given the output. So in the case of the HMMs, it's a generative model, and you're maximizing likelihood. In case of the CTC, it's a discriminative model, and you're maximizing the posterior probability. All right? You are maximizing the posterior probability under this assumption that the probability of a sequence of phonemes is a product of their individual probabilities. So there is an independence assumption in CTC. It's not assumption-free, right? Just a different kind of assumption on posterior probabilities instead. Here we have an assumption on the emissions being conditionally independent given the state. You have an assumption on the posterior probability being independent given the input. And these, in fact, are like CRFs. So nowadays, I don't know if it's fashionable to teach conditional random fields, but if you ever read it, this is exactly what it is. All right, no difference. And people will argue how CRFs are better than HMM for something or the other. All those arguments hold, and they're better and they're worse and they're everything else. They're just an alternative. Okay, that's CTC. But remember, when you train neural nets, you don't need just the calculation of the loss. What else do you need? You need the gradient of the loss relative to the HMM parameters. What about that? Well, let's calculate the gradient. So what happens is, what I need to know is I won't need to know the gradient of this loss relative to one of these HMM parameters, sorry, neural net parameters over here. Meaning, if I change the value of this weight, how much does this change? So I want the derivative of one of these guys with respect to one of these guys. This guy already is a pretty crazy calculation. So how do I get its derivative with respect to one of these guys? Well, let's break it into two steps. First, let's get the derivative of one of these probabilities with respect to these guys, right? The derivative of the probability of K relative to this weight. We know how to do that. That's straight up vanilla neural net stuff. You can backprop. And then multiply that with the derivative of this guy with respect to this probability. So use the chain rule to your advantage. To compute the derivative of the loss with respect to a weight, compute the derivative of the loss with respect to an output, and then the derivative of the output with respect to the weight. That comes for free because you already know how to do it. When I say free, it doesn't come for free. You already know how to do it. So I just need to teach you how to compute the derivative of the loss relative to one of the output probabilities. Everybody with me? So what you need is the derivative of L with respect to one of these weights. What will I teach you? Compute the derivative of L with respect to one of these probabilities. What will you do after that? Compute the derivative of the probability with respect to the weight using your favorite method. And multiply the two and you get what you want. Pretty good? Okay, let's do the derivative. Okay, here's where you have to pay attention. So L is over here, dl by d of p of a particular phoneme phi. Let's focus on the n, right? With respect to yj, j is the time index. Right. So if I look at this, where does P of phi given yj appear? Well, it appears inside this product. But it only appears inside the product if this boldface T, the path, contains this phoneme phi, the blue one, at that time j. All right? So therefore, if I look at the sum and inside the sum, the product, this thing with respect to which I'm differentiating will appear at most once when I is equal to j, And even then, it'll appear provided the path actually goes through that phoneme phi at time j. Right? Okay, good. When it does, what is the derivative? Well, it's a product of n things, a1, a2 up to an. I'm differentiating with respect to one of them, aj. So what I'm left with is a1, a2, a up to an, except for aj, because that's the one that disappears. If I have a product of n things, I differentiate with respect to one of them, I'm left with the others. So I'm going to put that thing back in and divide by it. So this thing remains the same as that, and I've got this p of phi given y at the bottom. So far, so good? Who have I lost? Anyone? Okay, but that's only the thing inside the sum, right? But that's okay, because derivatives can go inside the sum. But what about this log in front? Well, the derivative log of something is 1 over that something. So I'll just put that whole sum over here in the bottom. Okay, everybody happy with my calculus 3 abilities? That's all it takes, calculus 3. Or 2, actually, not even 3. Yeah, okay. Are we done yet? No, we didn't send it. We knew how to compute this beast. Remember, this sum is huge. It has many, 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 many parts. I've got 2 of them here now, one here and one here. How's it going to work? Well, let's work through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this term over here. Since the sum is, oh, by the way, the sum is all parts t such that at time j, t sub j, the phoneme that you go through, is the blue phoneme against which you're differentiating. Right? That's the one whose derivative you need from the output. All right, so I'm going to pull this outside the sum. I'm going to put this sum underneath, and I'm going to get this. So this guy is over here. This sum is on top. This sum is at the bottom. Okay, how does one compute this? Our good friend, the lattice, right? So here's what happens. So this lower sum is easy. We know how to compute it. It's the same as the CTC loss. What's this upper sum? It is the sum of probabilities along all paths which at time j go through phoneme phi. So let's say this is our time j, and this is my phoneme phi. So this is where the mouse is. I'll keep moving it because otherwise my computer goes to sleep. So this is the phoneme and the time index at which I'm interested in computing this derivative, right? So I want the sum of all paths that go through this node only, no other paths, right? And I want their total probability. So I can take the sum of all paths coming from here to here, and then all paths going from here to there. Okay? And those are 2 mini versions of the same big problem. Just take this big rectangle and chop it up into 2 rectangles, whose corner is the phi at the time j that you care about. So this is 1 through j minus 1. This is j plus 1 through n. And among all these, this is the phi you care about. Everybody see the picture? Therefore, you run the same algorithm once on the upper half of this thing, once on the lower half of that thing, multiply the 2, and that gives you the numerator. Yes? In other words, computing CTC loss is the same as the HMM calculation. Computing the derivative of the CTC loss is the same as the forward calculation. It's all the same material being repurposed. That's why you should write reusable code. So if you have 3 projects, you don't program thrice, you just program once. All good? Okay, so we got CTC under control. Not quite. I made it that way because I wanted you to see and compare it with what I was doing. Alex, in his infinite wisdom, did some weird stuff. He said, I'll have the composite HMM, but I'll introduce this blank symbol. Complete unnecessary thing, but it's okay. We'll keep it. Unnecessary mathematically, right? I've changed things a little bit, by the way. Now my self loops are on the second state of the phoneme HMM. Doesn't matter, it's the same thing, right? And so the possible strings look like this now. What does this mean? It means to say cat and hat, I can either say nothing for a while, produce you blank symbols, say cur, produce more blank symbols, say produce an produce as many as I want. So this machine produces a different set of strings. It has these blanks between or around every phoneme or lexical token, right? What does this do? Well, if this is our speech, This is our composite HMM without these blank symbols. Then these were all the state sequences over which I had to sum to get my CTC objective, right? Well, once I throw in the blank, I have a few more things to sum over. So the gray symbols are back now. So if you notice, the gray loops are in. And now there are many more sequences that are possible, right? With blanks stuffed in between to your heart's content. You still have to stay within 1 to n, but other than that, and you still have the cat and hat. But other than that, you can do whatever you like. So let's just add one more output node. The probabilities are not over all the phonemes, but over the phonemes plus blank. Does anything change? So unless the number of phonemes is hardwired in your code, everything just works. So don't hardwire variables. All good? So this is Graves' CTC paper. If you think about it, it's no different from everything else we did, right? Matthew, by the way, in the lab will explain to you how this is actually one step away from doing maximum mutual information properly, in the sense that, remember in the MMI equation, there was a denominator term, sum over all phi tildes of P of y given phi tilde. That's not there in CTC, right? So that's the key thing. And that's the one that makes you, like, actually gives you a better model, right? But other than that, there's not a whole lot of else going on. So let me see, why do I have this picture? Oh yeah, this is just to say, so this is the CTC objective. It sums over all possible things, and now the change is the output has the colored stuff, the cat and hat phonemes, plus the blank symbol, right? So done with CDC. Any questions? Because things are going to get even more complicated. Right, okay, so I have 20 minutes, let me wrap up. Let me go through the next couple of ideas. Oh, this is, okay. So all these HMM ideas were still in there, right? After all, I was using HMM code to compute CTC loss and its derivatives. So somehow it seems to have not really left. It's left its DNA in there everywhere. So can we do completely without it, right? Purely CTC. So Baidu guys tried this, and so this is a paper from 2016. So although Alex Graves wrote his paper in 2006 or something, nothing happened for a long time. People didn't take him seriously until these Baidu guys came along and built a speech recognizer, which is purely CTC based. So what did they do? Well, they took this basic architecture. This is more or less what Alex mentioned in his paper. They said, oh, we're going to replace this with an LSTM. Oh, no, we're going to do even better. We're going to replace it with a bidirectional LSTM. So we're all making these incremental changes to the network, trying this topology and that topology. And we're going to train this with the CTC objective. By the way, one of the things that's sort of interesting that comes with the CTC objective is that what the neural net does for you is takes the speech and populates these columns of probabilities. You still have to find the best path. So there's where things become complicated, because with CTC, you have a frame-by-frame independence assumption. You have to figure out which path you want to take. The greedy way would be to simply take the most likely symbol in each column. It might be an absurd phoneme sequence, may not correspond to any words. You might be changing phonemes every 10 milliseconds, which is physically very hard, if not impossible. For humans, it's impossible. Some machines could do it, right? So you really need to bring in something else. But that's what the deep speech guys did, got a lot of attention, and people started saying, oh, we should build HM speech recognizers this way, right? In the meantime, something else was happening. People were starting to use neural nets for machine translation. And so a bunch of guys from Bengio's lab said, hey, we're going to use machine translation ideas for speech recognition, right? And that involved this whole business of an encoder and a decoder. So you'll hear more about it tomorrow, because Philip is going to give a whole lecture on machine translation. So I won't spend a lot of mental energy now. I'll just give you a picture. So first, let's remember very briefly this LSTM language model from Schluter and company, right? So you start, you produce a word, use it to produce the next word, use that to produce the next word. Like, remember, the LSTM has a state which captures the long history, and the previous word is the only external input, and that's how it runs, right? So boom, 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 boom. So keep this in mind, because we're now going to put this together with the acoustic model idea that we had from the Baidu paper, Speech goes in. There's a LSTM that goes left to right, another LSTM that goes right to left. The third one, they use some other ideas. Remember I mentioned in one of our papers, we did downsampling in time. So you do the downsampling in time, and that way you get inputs from 2 frames of the previous LSTM up to the frame of the next LSTM. You do the same thing for the backwards one. 2 frames of the previous LSTM go to the next one. So far, so good. In fact, we should think of this 2 layers together as one block. It's a bi-LSTM, if you will. And in that case, you want to have inputs from all the states of the bi-LSTM to all the states of the next bi-LSTM, right? So this is roughly more or less what happens in the Jan Korowski paper. Korowski is one of Bedjo's students, right? So the Korowski et al. Paper. And then you come up with your final one more layer, but this time you say, okay, I'm not going to do decoding on this right away. You know, CTC would get, by the way, these brown blocks lying this way, you could think of them as the colored blocks lying vertically. And no, but these don't have to be probabilities yet. They're just activations. And then you say, okay, let's now bring in that LSTM language model. So let's say that I've predicted a few frames, a few words rather, a few phonemes. And I want to make my next prediction. So this is where this attention business comes in, right? What you do is you take the current state of the LSTM, because it has produced some phonemes as output. It probably has some idea of what acoustics they correspond to. And it probably wants to look at the acoustics after that, right? So you say, okay, I'm going to figure out, based on the LSTM frame and all the acoustic representations over here, where I should process the next acoustic frames from, right? In machine translation, this made a lot of sense because these are not acoustic frames, these are input words. And so as Philip will explain to you tomorrow, as you process a French sentence, you look at individual words and then you come to a noun and you say, okay, I'll wait. And then you come to the adjective after that and you translate it. And after that you say, okay, what now? Okay, noun. Okay, then you go back and look at the noun. So attention makes a lot of sense in machine translation. Doesn't really make sense here, but what the hell, we'll try it, right? Because trying is easy. So you do that. So the basic equations look like this. So EIJ is some activation which says take the decoder state at time I-1, so Si-1, map it by some matrix to some lower dimension, take all the input frames Hj, j goes 1, 2, 3, 4 up to whatever, proportional to length and time, and map those to some same dimensional space C of Hj. In a product that gives you the affinity of the decoder state at time I with the input at time j for each j. Then you take these, you sort of renormalize them by exponentiation and all that to get, this is a softmax, if you will. And these alpha ij's are now the attention that the ith decoder state pays to the jth acoustic input. Are we all still together? Alpha ij. And then you simply do a sum. You sum up all the acoustic states with the weights provided by this alpha ij. So the ith decoder state asks for a combination of the j acoustic inputs, or j going 1 through n, based on these weights alpha ij. And then you simply say, that's what I'm going to pay attention to. So I've made some of these arrows bold, by the way, if you care about all my little art. So that's where you're paying more attention. And then you use that to produce the next phoneme. So one key difference between this architecture and the Baidu one, if you remember, the Baidu one went frame by frame. At every frame, there was a probability vector. And if you had to produce only 10 phonemes, 9 phonemes with 25 frames of input, you had to produce a bunch of blanks. And the decoder went frame by frame by frame. This decoder goes symbol by symbol. It can consume multiple frames, so the attention can be on many frames when it produces one symbol of output, right? Key difference in the way these two architectures work. Useful, good, bad, better, worse, you be the judge, right? Okay, and then at the next time frame, I has been updated. It was not I-1. So at this time, you again do another bit of this attention computation. This time you take the next decoder state, compute its affinity for all the speech frames, figure out the alphas, add up those according to the alpha weights. You now get the next frame or the next aggregated frame of the acoustics that the decoder should be looking at. You know, in a simplified explanation of the world, Like, when I was in high school, I was told, oh yeah, the atoms are like the solar system. The nucleus is a solid, heavy thing in the middle, and these little balls are flying around. And then I went to first year of college and it's a cloud. We don't know where the thing is. So it's a bit like that. If I had to do a simple explanation of this, I'd say, yeah, they paid attention to these three frames first. It got the N. Now it's going to pay attention to the next few frames and get the and so on and so forth. Right? You can think of it that way. Life is not that simple, but hey, that's okay. So you get the next one, and this goes on. Boom, boom. So this is your encoder-decoder with attention. Right? So you can see the evolution of ideas. There is still the core acoustic model at the bottom. But instead of producing probabilities on your phonemes, plus the blank symbol, maybe just in whatever representation is, hold on to it. And while I'm decoding, I'll figure out which chunks of the input I want to process. And I'll take the acoustic representation there. Oh, and by the way, this time I have brought my language model back in. Remember in the CTC decoding, there was nothing about the language. You had to provide something externally if you wanted one. Now it's all part of the architecture. And so the decoder has some state which tells it what previous phonemes it had produced, looks at the acoustics, picks a piece of it, produces the next phoneme, moves on and on. Right? Okay. Everybody happy? Any questions about this architecture? It's one of the standard ones that's used out there. So when people will throw things like attention to you, you know what they're talking about, decoder state, encoder representations, blah, blah, blah. All is good. Okay. So have we gone very far away from our original formulation of the problem, P of A given W, P of W? Well, not really. So the last idea I'm going to introduce today is called a recurrent neural net transducer, or an RNNT. Right? And I say this is coming full circle back to the basic mathematical formulation. Why is that? Well, there was another paper by Graves in 2012, which again didn't get any attention until this appeared in an ICML workshop in 2012. And in that, he introduced this idea, called it sequence transduction with neural nets, until the Google guys used that idea and created a killer solution to a problem of theirs, namely how to do speech recognition on device. Right? And this paper gets cited a lot. Oh, sorry, I said yeah, so this is not 2012. I should fix this. Okay, that's for real-time slide editing. Okay, so 7 years later or 8 years later, everybody started paying attention to these things, right? So what is the idea over here? Well, I'm going to reuse pictures because I really want you to see that it's the same things being. Do you know this New York City thing where there's a coin and then there are 3 cups and then you put them on that and you move them around? Yeah, just think of that. So this should look familiar. This is kind of the Baidu model, if you will, right? Just pure CTC. The colored stuff are the posterior probabilities in the phonemes, and you do the recognition. There are a couple of BLSTM-like things in there. This is the Ralph Schluter language model. It has an LSTM. It takes phonemes as inputs and previous state and produces phoneme probabilities as output. This output has this blank symbol in its probabilities. This has only phonemes. How about we combine these two? In fact, if you're going to combine them, we don't need these to be probabilities yet, right? We can just let them be some representation and combine them. So we're going to build this thing called a joiner. Okay. And what this joiner is going to do is it's going to take the best of this frame synchronous CTC-like thing and label synchronous language model-like thing and say, I'm going to take these 2 frames, the acoustic frame at time 1 and the language or the predict. By the way, this thing is still called the encoder, and this is no longer called the decoder, it's called the predictor. Let me do one more real-time change in slide. Okay, predictor network, there we go. So we're going to join these 2 and produce a probability on the phonemes. I'm going to take some acoustic information, take some language information. And I'm going to move forward in time and take the next acoustic frame and the next language model prediction frame, and again, put probabilities on the output. I'm just combining acoustic and language information, except for one difference. So in the first frame, I moved the language model state forward because I output some symbol, let's say a car. Second time, I may produce a blank. So the language model state does not advance, but you move forward anyway. So the third prediction is made from the same language model state, but the next frame in the acoustic states. This time, let's say we produce a symbol as an output rather than the blank. The next time, things move forward again, right? And again, right? And this goes on. And you produce all the output. So again, you move through the acoustic frames at some rate, and you move through the phones at some other rate. And every time you produce a non-null, non-blank output, you advance in this state, and this one you advance frame synchronously. And the whole thing is basically your recognizer. So if you look at it this way now, we have our acoustic model, we have our language model. This thing does the combining and do the decoding. So the basic elements are still there. A lot of things are different though, because this is not producing likelihoods, P of A given W. This is not producing P of W. They're just producing internal representations. More importantly, the representations are discriminative. This is trying to discriminate between sounds. And this, interestingly, this is my own take on it. This is not a pure language model in the sense of predicting the next word. This is what I would call an acoustically discriminating language model. In other words, it matters only if the acoustics are ambiguous to know which word is likely. Otherwise, it more or less doesn't matter, right? Training these things is a bit of a bear because you can train it based on various objectives. The simplest one is like the MMI objective. You simply maximize the posterior probability of the output sequence given the acoustic inputs. And Matthew will talk more about it in the lab, yes? RNNT loss. Okay, all right, okay. But similar idea. Okay, so this is where the field is in a lot of mobile devices. In fact, in many cases, especially when you need streaming applications, one change you can make is this was a bi-LSTM over here for the encoder. You can always make it a left to right encoder, an encoder that only looks one way. And that way you can deploy this in streaming situations where you can't wait till the end of the utterance to decide when to transcribe. It's a little bit like if you did that, your conversation with Alexa would go something like, Alexa, what's the weather? The weather today is 70 degrees. That lag is because Alexa first had to wait to figure out you had stopped. And then after it was sure that you had stopped, it started processing. Its processing is blazingly fast, 100 times faster than real time. But just that latency is too much to take, right? So in a lot of applications of speech, you need streaming. So this architecture has become very popular. If you're working on back-end bulk processing type things, people still like the encoder-decoder models, especially because you can bolt them together with translation models and so on and so forth. So there are lots of other things, right? So let me stop here. I have 5 minutes. So let me summarize. So in the second part today, what did we talk about? We talked about neural acoustic models. Sorry, question before I go. Yes. Yeah. How do you join? So the joiner is typically pretty straightforward. It just takes 2 frames as input, produces an output, fully connected. Matthew, what's typical?
Like it's the dimensions of the encoder match the predictor.
So literally just sum them, nothing else. Concatenation, you know what? It's like, remember, they're both producing similar things. They're both essentially going after some kind of posterior probability on the output vocabulary, right? Some representation from which you can compute a probability on the output vocabulary. So the pre-softmax of what you need to do.
Same, adding linear transformation.
That's true. So identity 0, 0 identity, concatenate, multiply, that adds to the other. Okay. All right. So yeah, the joiners are pretty simple. In fact, I'll say this, that I showed you this picture with LSTMs as the predictor because that's what was there in the original paper and what the Google guys published. In reality, while training, you don't use something that complicated. You just use an n-gram approximation. So you have no long-term dependencies and so on and so forth. In fact, you can even use it during decoding if you like. Okay. All right. So let me reach my last slide. We still have time for questions. So quick summary. I talked to you about how you can do acoustic modeling only in the traditional framework. There was the Weibull paper from long ago. Then we had our TDNN paper. You can train it using maximum mutual information. That's our preferred way of training it. You could train it with cross entropy if you had frame alignments. You don't have to. Then I talked about neural language models, how the n-gram-like model started with Nakamura and went through. I should have put Mikolov in here. Mikolov's paper in 2010, which was important to the Sundermeyer, Ralph Schluter, Herman Nye paper to the STMs. I told you a little bit about CTC, Alex's original paper, and the Baidu guys later made it better. And then so that's this one, this Hanun et al. And then, by the way, I think Alex with Navdeep Jaitley also had a paper around the same time called Listen, Attend, and Spell. They're all, yeah. And then I talked a little bit about these attention-based models, which was Korowski and company from Benjio's lab. And last but not the least, I talked about the Google paper, which basically made Alex's RNNT paper real. So let me stop here and see if you have questions. Yes. Okay. So acoustics in some ways are a bit more like images than text in the sense that there are global effects. There might be a loudness or a speaker trait, just like images have global color effects. There's a lot of like local dependence, local continuity constraints. So they're all a bit like that. By the way, I never showed you a single transformer in any of my pictures, but these days, these encoders are pretty much all transformers, right? Some of them are transformers that have attention only to the left if you want to make streaming applications, but essentially they're all transformers. Even all the way back, our TDNN paper, nowadays we replace those with transformers as well. So they're similar to images in that sense. They pretty much all seem to benefit from having a few convolutional layers before you throw on the transformers or the LSTMs. So if you remember the Baidu paper also, it had a few convolutional layers before they started doing the bi-LSTMs. So all that seems to be a property of continuous valued signals like speech and images. With text, you can make the jump immediately into a representation at the very first layer from a one-hot encoding to a continuous representation and then go from there. So you could have a transformer right away after that or something. So that would be one. Am I answering your question? Is that what you wanted to know? Yeah. No, and by the way, different people have different intuitions. Matthew will tell you more in the lab, and maybe he has a different intuition or the same one, whatever you feel. Paula has intuitions. There are others around here who know this well. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Joint learning with text and audio is aligned. Do you have any other representation learning separate to acoustic information?
Yeah, so good question. So yesterday, Kevin explained to you the difference between models like BERT, which were simply used as some kind of pretext task. And then the whole purpose of the model was to extract representations, and you'd then do some specific tasks where you had labeled input-output pairs and you'd do supervised learning. And so BERT was considered the unsupervised or the pre-training part of that model, which you could either keep fixed later on or you could continue to fine-tune while you trained it on, let's say, a sense disambiguation or a sentiment recognition or a whatever task, right? Named entity recognition. So in the same way, in the speech world, there's a whole family of models which is trained purely on speech, again, trained with some of these masked language model-like objectives that Kevin was telling you about yesterday. And they all end up playing the role of feature extraction. So in this model, those colored bars you see at the bottom, I said, let's think MFCCs, but in reality, you could use one of those models as starters. And when you don't have a lot of labeled speech or transcribed speech to train on, starting with those is significantly better than starting with something like MFCCs, because in the process of doing that unlabeled training, they end up doing a lot of sound discrimination internally and producing representations that are different compared to just MFCCs, right? So that's one answer. The other answer I could give you is that you can do multilingual training in that setting. So you could train on speech from multiple languages and then cut off everything. So imagine that I trained a model like this, right? And then I throw away the decoder and the joiner for the language I trained on, and I start with a decoder and joiner for a new language, and I could just work with that. So those kinds of things are around. What else is around? That's a partial answer to your question. Yeah. So there's a fair bit of work on unlabeled data, absolutely. Other questions? No? Going once? Any comments, Matthew, Paula, or anybody else who knows more than me? There are a few. No? Okay. Thank you very much. Let's break for lunch. And Matthew, we're coming back at 1:30. Okay. All right. Maybe we should check what time it starts.